I am Waylon, 69 years old, and somehow still processing the sheer audacity of my own blood. After hosting a massive family reunion, I discovered my primary bank account was completely drained. When I confronted my son and his white daughter-in-law, she looked me dead in the eye and laughed, saying they simply needed it more. I did not scream. I just said okay and made a single phone call. She could not laugh anymore after that. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who severely underestimated your worth. The remaining balance for the catering is $4,000, Mr. Right. The caterer stood in my backyard holding a digital payment tablet. The thick scent of smoked brisket and grilled hot links lingered in the warm evening air. My family reunion had just wrapped up. I had hosted 40 relatives in the backyard of the house my late wife Diana and I built from the ground up right here in Atlanta. I pulled out my debit card. Go ahead and swipe it. The machine beeped loudly. A sharp red error screen flashed across the display. Declined, the caterer said, shifting his weight and looking visibly uncomfortable. I frowned. Run it again. There is $85,000 in that checking account. I transferred my municipal transit pension payout just yesterday. The machine beeped again. Declined. I stepped away from the crowded patio and pulled out my mobile phone. I opened my banking application. The loading circle spun for a second before my checking account balance stared back at me in bold black numbers. $0.00. My heart slammed heavily against my ribs. I tapped the transaction history. A single wire transfer had cleared 2 hours ago right in the middle of the barbecue. $85,000 had been sent directly to a commercial account named Heather's Haven LLC. Heather is my daughter-in-law. I paid the caterer using a backup credit card from my wallet and walked slowly back into the house. The living room was an absolute disaster of empty plastic cups and crumpled paper napkins. Devin, my son, sat lazily on my leather recliner, laughing loudly at something playing on the television. Heather stood casually by the kitchen island, pouring herself a glass of expensive champagne I had specifically saved for my upcoming 70th birthday. Watching them luxuriate in my home triggered a sharp, visceral memory. I spent 40 years working the graveyard shift at the Municipal Transit Authority to ensure this boy never had to struggle a day in his life. Diana and I spent decades inhaling diesel fumes and scrubbing grease off our hands so we could buy this property outright and leave him a generational legacy. I paid for his college tuition in cash. I allowed them to live in my house rent-free for 2 years while they claimed to be finding their footing in the corporate world. Now, my 40 years of grueling labor culminated in a zero balance while the two of them drank my vintage champagne. I walked up to the kitchen island and placed my phone on the granite counter directly in front of her. "Where is my money?" Heather took a slow, deliberate sip of her champagne. She did not flinch. She did not look away. She looked me right in the eye and let out a chilling, condescending laugh. "Oh, Waylon," she said, waving a freshly manicured hand in the air. "We transferred it. We needed it more." Devin stopped laughing at the television. He did not stand up. He stared intently at his phone, suddenly pretending to be very interested in a blank screen. "You stole $85,000 from my account," I stated. My voice was dangerously low, perfectly controlled. "Stole is a very harsh word," Heather scoffed, rolling her eyes. "You are 69 years old. You sit in this massive house all day doing absolutely nothing. Devin and I are trying to build a modern wellness spa downtown. We have real commercial expenses. You should be proud to invest in your son's future instead of hoarding cash you cannot possibly spend." I looked directly at Devin. "You authorize this?" "Dad, come on," Devin muttered, refusing to meet my furious gaze. "You have your monthly Social Security checks. You do not need that much cash sitting around doing nothing. We are putting it to good use to build an empire." I did not yell. I did not flip the granite kitchen island. I did not raise a hand. I looked at the two of them, processing the absolute betrayal from the boy I raised and the woman he married. "Okay," I said softly. I picked up my phone, turned my back on them, and walked straight down the hallway to my study. I stepped inside and locked the heavy oak door behind me. The shock of the betrayal evaporated entirely. It was instantly replaced by a cold, clinical precision. I was no longer a disappointed father dealing with an ungrateful child. I was a tactical adversary preparing to dismantle a threat. I sat at my mahogany desk and dialed the private cell number of my attorney, Bradley. "Waylon, it is late," Bradley answered on the second ring. "Is everything all right? Devin and Heather just drained my primary checking account," I stated clearly. $85,000. They wired it directly to a commercial entity called Heather's Haven LLC. I heard the frantic rustle of papers on the other end of the line. Bradley typed rapidly on his keyboard, logging into my secure financial portal. "Waylon, I am accessing your portfolio right now," he said. "The checking account is indeed empty." But that is not the worst part. I tightened my grip on the phone. "Tell me." "They did not just take the cash," Bradley said, his voice dropping an entire octave. "There is a massive new lien on your house. They pulled a $200,000 home equity loan against this property 3 days ago. They used a forged power of attorney document to bypass your signature and approve the loan. A power of attorney." I repeated, feeling the walls of my study grow instantly colder. I never signed a power of attorney for anyone. "The document was notarized last Tuesday," Bradley explained. "The signature matches yours perfectly. They leveraged the equity of your home to secure a massive commercial lease downtown for that spa. If they default on this loan, the bank will seize your house." I hung up the phone, staring into the dark corner of my study, realizing my own son had just gambled my entire life. The sky over Atlanta was still a bruised purple when I pulled into the empty parking lot of Bradley's law firm. He was already waiting inside his glass-walled office, with a steaming cup of black coffee and a thick manila folder resting on his pristine desk. I sat down heavily and pulled the forged power of attorney document toward me. The signature at the bottom was practically flawless. The loop of the A and the sharp downward stroke of the N mirrored my handwriting with terrifying precision. I traced the black ink with my index finger, recognizing the distinct hesitation marks hidden within the cursive flow. Devin had used the old property tax forms I gave him last year to trace my name perfectly. Bradley leaned forward, his hands clasped together, ready to initiate a full legal assault. He strongly advised that we contact the Atlanta Police Department immediately to file a formal fraud report against my son. I held up my hand to stop him. Involving the authorities right now would trigger a standard criminal investigation, which meant my house would be locked in probate and tied up in civil court for years. The bank holding the fraudulent lien would have every right to seize the property while the legal system slowly processed the paperwork. I refused to let a bank take the home I built with my own 2 hands. I needed a surgical strike, not a chaotic legal battle. I handed the document back to him and shook my head. Looking at that meticulously copied signature brought a sharp, bitter memory rushing to the surface of my mind. I vividly remembered sitting at our kitchen table with Devin when he was 16 years old. I had just taken him to open his very first checking account with money from his summer job. I spent an hour teaching him how to sign his name with authority, telling him that a man's signature was his bond, his word, and his absolute honor. I taught him to press the pen firmly, so the world would know he stood behind whatever document he authorized. Now that same boy had weaponized that exact lesson to steal my life savings and gamble my legacy. The betrayal was a physical weight in my chest, but I pushed the emotion down and focused entirely on the logistics. I looked at Bradley and issued a clear command. I told him to trace the $85,000 wire transfer and locate the exact commercial property Heather was currently leasing for her ridiculous wellness spa. I needed to know the exact address and the name of the landlord who owned the building today. By 8 o'clock in the morning, Bradley had texted me the address. I drove straight to the old downtown warehouse district, parking my car across the street from a massive brick building. A shiny new vinyl banner hung carelessly over the main entrance, displaying the words, "Heather's Haven Wellness Spa coming soon." I kept my engine running and watched the scene unfold from the shadows of my vehicle. Several construction workers were hauling heavy sheets of drywall and pallets of expensive marble tiles into the building. Devin stood nervously on the cracked sidewalk, holding a yellow clipboard and wiping sweat from his forehead. A man wearing an official city inspector uniform marched out of the front doors, looking completely furious. I rolled down my window just enough to hear the loud confrontation echoing across the empty street. The inspector pointed aggressively at the clipboard. He told Devin that the plumbing did not meet basic commercial code and that he had to shut down the entire site immediately. The inspector demanded a complete structural overhaul, stating it would be a $50,000 job before they could even think about opening the doors to the public. Devin panicked entirely. He grabbed the inspector by the arm, begging him to reconsider because they were scheduled to open in just 3 weeks. Then, I watched my son commit a federal crime right out in the open. Devin reached into his tailored jacket, pulled out a thick white envelope bulging with cash, and shoved it directly into the inspector's hands. He pleaded with the man to simply approve the permit and sign the official paper. The inspector checked his surroundings, quickly pocketed the envelope, and walked away without looking back. I rolled my window up, my face set in stone. Devin was not just a thief who stole from his own father. I was incredibly desperate, cutting major corners and bribing municipal officials to keep his wife's vanity project afloat. He was building an empire on a crumbling foundation of sand. My phone vibrated violently against the center console. The caller identification displayed Heather's name. I answered the call, keeping my breathing perfectly steady. "Alton," she said, her voice dripping with an insufferable fake sweetness. "The caterers called me this morning complaining about an outstanding balance. You did not pay them last night. Do not embarrass us like that in front of our high society friends. We have a pristine image to maintain in this city." I gripped the steering wheel tightly. "The caterers will be paid," I said evenly. "How is the construction going?" She laughed, a sharp sound that grated against my ears. "Perfectly," she boasted. "We are creating a luxury experience unlike anything Atlanta has ever seen. You should really come pack your things, by the way. Devin and I decided we are going to sell your house next week to cover the spa's upcoming marketing budget. We already found a very nice assisted living facility for you in the suburbs. It is truly for your own good, Alton. Your memory is clearly failing, and you cannot be trusted to manage your own affairs anymore." They were no longer satisfied with just stealing my hard-earned money. They were actively trying to erase my existence, strip away my independence, and cast me out of my own home. I needed them to feel completely comfortable in their false victory. "I will start packing my things today," I said softly. I ended the call without waiting for her arrogant reply. I put the car in drive and navigated away from the warehouse district, heading toward a highly exclusive private wealth management firm on the north side of town. It was time to access the financial fortress Devin knew absolutely nothing about. I sat in a soundproof office across from my trusted wealth manager, Mitchell. I instructed him to immediately open the hidden offshore trust Diana and I had quietly funded and compounded over the last 20 years. I ordered Mitchell to initiate a swift and hostile corporate acquisition. I wanted my anonymous holding company to purchase the exact commercial building Heather was currently leasing using pure cash to bypass any bureaucratic delays. By the end of the business day, I would be her new landlord. Mitchell sat across from me in his high-rise office, his fingers moving rapidly across a sleek mechanical keyboard. He executed the transfer of $1.5 million from my offshore trust to an anonymous holding corporation with absolute surgical precision. Within 2 hours, the desperate owner of the warehouse district property accepted my pure cash offer without asking a single question. I was officially the new landlord of the exact building where my daughter-in-law was attempting to build her vanity project. I shook Mitchell by the hand, thanked him for his relentless efficiency, and drove back to my house in the quiet suburbs. The moment I walked through my front door, I tripped over a towering stack of heavy cardboard moving boxes blocking the main hallway. Devin stood at the top of the staircase holding a roll of thick packing tape. He marched down the stairs and aggressively pointed a finger right at my chest. He told me I needed to accept reality because my mental faculties were rapidly declining, and I was becoming a severe danger to myself. He declared that he had already scheduled a moving truck for the following morning to transport my belongings to a sterile assisted living facility on the outskirts of the city. He spoke to me with the slow, condescending tone one might use on a confused toddler, completely unaware that the supposedly senile old man standing before him had just purchased the literal ground beneath his arrogant feet. I stared past his pointing finger at the brown cardboard boxes carelessly stacked against the floral wallpaper Diana had chosen. Seeing those boxes triggered a heavy, suffocating memory of the brutal real estate redlining Diana and I had to fight against in the early 1980s just to purchase this specific plot of land. Banks repeatedly denied our mortgage applications simply because we were a young black couple trying to build a life in a predominantly white neighborhood. We faced slammed doors, inflated interest rates, and blatant discrimination at every single turn. We spilled our own blood, worked agonizing double shifts, and sacrificed our youth to secure a concrete piece of generational wealth for our future children. We fought a prejudiced system, so Devin would never have to experience that exact humiliation. Looking at him now, I realized he harbored absolutely no respect for the profound suffering that paved the way for his comfortable existence. He viewed this historic family sanctuary as nothing more than a giant piggy bank waiting to be smashed open and looted. The profound entitlement radiating from his posture completely extinguished any lingering paternal sympathy I still held for him in my guarded heart. I stepped around the moving boxes and walked toward the kitchen to pour myself a glass of cold water. I took a slow sip, letting the tense silence stretch across the room before I turned back to face my son. I casually asked him how the construction was going at the warehouse district and inquired if the city had finally approved their commercial plumbing permits. The color instantly drained from Devin's face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. He dropped the roll of packing tape onto the hardwood floor with a loud thud. He stammered, demanding to know exactly how I had acquired information regarding the internal plumbing inspections of their private business venture. I offered him a blank, stoic expression and simply noted that old buildings always possess old faulty pipes, wishing him the best of luck with his municipal paperwork. He stood frozen in the hallway, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic as the terrifying realization washed over him that his supposedly senile father knew entirely too much about his secret operations. I left him suffocating in his own anxiety and walked into my study, locking the heavy oak door for the second time that week. I sat at my desk and immediately dialed Bradley. I informed my attorney that I was now the official owner of the commercial building housing Heather's fraudulent spa. I ordered Bradley to send an immediate legal notice of inspection to the tenants at Heather's Haven LLC before the end of the business hour. I demanded a full structural and plumbing audit by tomorrow morning, leveraging my absolute authority as their new landlord. I knew with complete certainty that the heavily bribed permits would fail a rigorous independent inspection. I instructed Bradley that the very moment they failed the audit, he was to issue an immediate breach of contract and a formal eviction notice. I wanted them thrown out onto the street before they could lay a single piece of that expensive marble tile. I hung up the phone and waited patiently for the inevitable collapse of their stolen empire. The following morning, a sharply dressed real estate agent arrived at my house to conduct the official appraisal for the illicit sale Devin had orchestrated. Devin greeted her at the front door with an overly enthusiastic handshake, desperate to finalize the transaction and secure his stolen funds. He guided her into the living room, bragging about the pristine condition of the hardwood floors and demanding the property be listed on the market by Friday. Before the agent could pull a measuring tape from her designer purse, her mobile phone rang loudly. She answered the call and her professional smile vanished instantly. She looked at Devin with an expression of profound professional discomfort. She informed him that her primary broker had just contacted her because the title company flagged the forged power of attorney document. She explained that the primary homeowner, Waylon Wright, had filed a massive federal fraud alert on the property title early that morning. The panicked agent stated she could not legally list or sell the house under any circumstances and quickly rushed out the front door. Devin turned gray, staring at me as I stood quietly in the hallway. Simultaneously, Heather burst through the front door, clutching a certified legal document in her trembling hands. She shrieked that the anonymous owner of their commercial building had just served them with a 24-hour eviction notice due to illegal structural modifications and completely invalid municipal plumbing permits. Their entire commercial lease was instantly terminated, and they were legally barred from entering the premises. Their grand luxury spa was permanently shut down, and the lucrative sale of my historic home was completely blocked by the federal alert. Heather paced the living room floor, her face twisted into a mask of pure, desperate fury. She realized her stolen financial empire had crumbled before it ever truly began. Standing by the kitchen island, I watched her whisper frantically into my teen's ear. I could hear her venomous tone as she convinced Devin to take the most extreme and unforgivable measure yet. She demanded that he reach out to his illicit contacts to hire a corrupt black market doctor. Her ultimate goal was to secure fraudulent medical documents officially diagnosing me with severe incapacitating dementia. She intended to present these totally fake medical records to a sympathetic judge to seize total legal and financial control over my entire life, permanently stripping away my fundamental human rights. Bradley called me on a secure line before the sun had fully crested the horizon the following morning. He had placed a strict monitoring flag on my social security number the moment we discovered the forged power of attorney, and that precaution had just paid off. Bradley informed me that an unauthorized medical inquiry had been made in my name by a private clinic known for operating strictly in cash and moral gray areas. Heather had found a disgraced physician willing to review fictitious symptoms provided by my son and sign an official declaration of mental incompetence without ever laying eyes on me. They were actively drafting the legal framework to have me involuntarily committed to a psychiatric ward. I did not raise my voice or curse their names. I simply absorbed the reality of their malice. They intended to legally erase my autonomy, steal my voice, and strip me of my most basic human rights. I gripped the phone, staring out the window at the dew on the grass, realizing that the people I had welcomed into my home were orchestrating my legal death. I instructed Bradley to let them continue drafting their fraudulent paperwork, knowing that a trap is only effective when the prey walks willingly into the center of the cage. Hearing about their plans to weaponize the medical system against me pulled a deeply painful memory to the forefront of my mind. I remembered sitting in a sterile hospital room, holding Diana's fragile hand during her final days on this earth. The rhythmic beeping of her heart monitor was the only sound in the room as I leaned close to her face and made a solemn vow. I promised my dying wife that I would fiercely protect the generational legacy we had sacrificed our entire youth to build. Diana had looked at me with absolute trust, knowing I would never let our life's work be squandered or stolen. Now Devon was using the very institution of medicine to mock that sacred promise. I refused to let grief or anger cloud my judgment. I channeled the profound sorrow of losing my wife into a precise, emotionless counterattack. I would not allow a greedy daughter-in-law and a cowardly son to dismantle the fortress Diana and I constructed. I put on my best tailored suit, tied my leather shoes with deliberate focus, and prepared to secure the ultimate impenetrable medical defense. I drove my car away from the suburbs and parked in the private garage of the most respected board-certified neurology clinic in the state of Georgia. I did not sneak into a back alley office with envelopes of stolen cash like Heather. I walked through the front doors of a prestigious medical institution and requested a comprehensive psychiatric and cognitive evaluation from the chief of neurology. For 4 exhausting hours, I sat in a brightly lit examination room, answering highly complex psychological questions, solving intricate mathematical puzzles, and completing rigorous memory retention exercises. The neurologist monitored my brain activity, tested my logical reasoning, and assessed my emotional stability with absolute clinical scrutiny. When the grueling examinations finally concluded, the chief neurologist sat across his mahogany desk and handed me an official notarized medical affidavit. The doctor expressed profound surprise at the sharpness of my recall, noting that my mental acuity rivaled men 20 years my junior. He signed the heavy parchment paper with a fountain pen, sealing the documentation with the official hospital crest. The medical report was entirely bulletproof, backed by the unassailable reputation of a leading medical authority. By securing this legitimate assessment, I completely neutralized the black market doctor's fake diagnosis before Heather could even file it with the county clerk. If they attempted to present their fraudulent paperwork to a family court judge, my legal team would immediately counter with this irrefutable affidavit, instantly exposing their hired physician as a criminal fraud. I folded the pristine medical document, slid it carefully into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket, and walked out of the clinic feeling like an armored fortress. I had fortified my mind in the eyes of the law, ensuring they could never steal my independence. Their entire strategy to declare me a senile ward of the state had been silently dismantled before they even paid the final installment to their corrupt physician. While I was securing my medical defense, the private investigator I retained through Bradley's firm was busy untangling Heather's incredibly messy financial trail. He sent an encrypted file to my phone detailing exactly how my daughter-in-law had managed to afford the hefty bribe required by her illicit doctor. She had completely bypassed Devon for this transaction, operating entirely on her own arrogant ambition. Heather had recklessly leveraged the mortgage of her own luxury suburban home to pull out a massive sum of liquid cash. The investigator's report revealed a fatal flaw in her desperate financial maneuvering. In her haste to secure the bribe money to steal my estate, she had completely drained her personal accounts and subsequently missed her last 2 monthly mortgage payments. Her pristine credit score was rapidly collapsing, and her primary lender had already issued internal warnings regarding the delinquent status of her sprawling, overpriced property. She was living in a glass house, throwing stones at my concrete foundation, entirely unaware that her own roof was about to cave in. She had severely overextended her finances, assuming she would soon have total access to my lifetime savings to cover her disastrous tracks. Her arrogance blinded her to the basic principles of financial gravity. She truly believed she could float her fraudulent lifestyle on stolen equity just long enough to have me locked away in a sterile facility. The investigator highlighted the specific private lending institution that held the note on her suburban mansion. It was a mid-level regional bank known for aggressive collection tactics. I read the investigator's comprehensive report and immediately contacted Mitchell at the wealth management firm. I instructed my financial advisor to quietly approach Heather's desperate mortgage lender through my anonymous corporate holding company. Utilizing a fraction of the capital sitting securely in my offshore trust, I ordered Mitchell to purchase the delinquent debt on Heather and Devon's primary residence outright. The regional bank, eager to offload a toxic asset, gladly accepted my substantial cash offer by the end of the business day. The legal transfer was swift, completely silent, and entirely binding. I sat in my study staring at the freshly printed deed transfer that Mitchell had securely couriered to my house. I was no longer just the landlord of their failed commercial spa. I now officially owned the very roof over their heads. The heavy brass knocker on my front oak door echoed through the quiet house just before noon. I remained seated in my leather reading chair while Devin rushed to answer it, still frantically dialing his defunct commercial contractors. A uniformed courier stood on the porch and handed a thick certified envelope directly to Heather, requiring her physical signature. She tore the thick paper open with aggressive impatience, her manicured fingers ripping the official seal. As her eyes scanned the heavy legal text, the remaining color completely drained from her face. The document was a formal notice of default and intent to foreclose on their primary residence. She dropped her phone onto the hardwood floor and began hyperventilating. She shrieked that their regional mortgage lender had sold their entire debt portfolio to an anonymous private holding corporation overnight. This new, faceless owner was strictly enforcing the penalty clauses she had ignored when she carelessly missed her last 2 payments to afford her black market doctor. The holding company demanded the immediate full payment of all accumulated arrears by the end of the business week, or they would initiate an expedited foreclosure process to seize the property. Devin snatched the paper from her trembling hands, his eyes widening in sheer terror as he read the unyielding legal demands. They were officially trapped in a financial vice, completely unaware that the anonymous corporate executioner squeezing the air from their lungs was sitting comfortably just 20 feet away in the living room. I watched their absolute panic unfold from the comfort of my reading chair, maintaining a perfectly blank expression. Seeing Heather tremble over the imminent loss of her sprawling suburban mansion brought a very distinct memory into sharp focus. For years, she had weaponized that specific zip code to assert her perceived superiority over my family. During Thanksgiving dinners and casual Sunday visits, she consistently bragged about the prestigious gated community she resided in, using her elite address to subtly belittle the historically working-class blue-collar neighborhood where Diana and I had proudly built our home. She treated my concrete driveway and brick facade as quaint relics of a lesser economic class, entirely ignoring the fact that my property was owned free and clear while hers was leveraged to the absolute hilt. She built her entire identity around a fragile illusion of high society wealth, desperately masking a hollow reality built entirely on compounding debt. Now that glittering facade was crumbling into dust before my eyes. The sprawling estate she used to demean my life's work was slipping through her fingers, reclaimed by the very same quiet, diligent wealth she had spent a decade ruthlessly mocking. Heather turned her absolute fury onto her husband, her voice reaching a hysterical pitch that rattled the glass in the window panes. She screamed at Devin to fix this catastrophic financial ruin, immediately demanding he drain whatever emergency funds he had hidden away to save her precious house. Devin practically sprinted to the kitchen counter, tearing open his laptop and frantically hammering his login credentials into the banking portal. His face twisted into a grotesque mask of pure horror when the screen loaded. He realized his personal bank accounts, his business accounts, and his shared credit lines were completely frozen and inaccessible. The federal fraud alerts I had initiated that morning to block the sale of my house had cascaded across his entire financial identity, triggering automatic security freezes at every institution tied to his social security number. He had zero access to liquid capital. In a blind, animalistic panic, Devin bolted out the back door and sprinted toward my detached garage. He knew exactly what was kept inside. I had spent the last 10 years meticulously restoring 2 vintage classic cars, pouring thousands of hours and premium parts into bringing those beautiful machines back to life. I kept the original signed titles locked in a metal filing cabinet near the workbench. Devin shattered the side window of the garage with a heavy garden stone, tearing the filing cabinet open with reckless desperation. He grabbed the pristine blue title documents, intending to sell my beloved vehicles on the underground black market for a massive influx of untraceable cash. He believed he could flip the classic cars by midnight to satisfy the holding company and save his suburban mansion. He operated under the pathetic delusion that his frantic theft was going unnoticed, completely ignoring the fact that desperate men always make fatal, sloppy mistakes when they believe they are running out of time. He shoved the stolen titles deep into his jacket pocket and sprinted toward his vehicle, ready to trade a decade of my careful craftsmanship to the lowest criminal bidder just to secure another month in a house he could never truly afford. I did not flinch or react as the loud sound of shattering glass echoed violently across the backyard. I simply picked up my tablet and opened the live feed from the high-definition security cameras I had quietly installed around the perimeter of my property last month. I watched the crystal-clear footage of my son destroying my property and stealing the registration documents for my classic cars. I dialed Bradley, holding the phone to my ear as I monitored Devin speeding away down the street. I informed my attorney that my son had just committed grand theft auto by stealing the physical titles to my vintage vehicles. Bradley immediately advised me to call the police dispatch, stating we had irrefutable video evidence to have Devin arrested for felony theft within the hour. I flatly refused his legal advice. Arresting Devin now would simply put him in a holding cell, safe from the violent consequences of his own reckless greed. I wanted him to complete the illegal sale. I knew exactly who operated the classic car black market in this specific region of Atlanta. They were incredibly dangerous, unforgiving men who did not tolerate complications or fraudulent business dealings. I wanted my son to take their illicit money, binding himself to a criminal syndicate that operated far outside the protective boundaries of the standard local legal system. If he wanted to act like a ruthless criminal to save his wife's vanity, he needed to experience the absolute terror of dealing with actual predators. By the time the sun set over the city skyline, Devin successfully fenced both of my classic cars to a notorious underground broker operating out of a dusty salvage yard on the outer city limits. He walked away with a heavy duffel bag packed with $70,000 in untraceable cash, believing he had finally secured his salvation. The very minute the cash touched his hands, I logged into the Department of Motor Vehicles digital portal using my verified credentials. I officially reported both vintage vehicles and their corresponding identification numbers as stolen, triggering an immediate, irreversible federal flag in the national database. The pristine blue titles Devin handed over were instantly rendered completely worthless. He had just sold incredibly hot, heavily tracked stolen property to a brutal criminal syndicate. He took their cash, leaving them holding toxic assets and thoroughly infuriated dangerous buyers who demanded blood for bad business. The underground broker did not wait long to discover the severe complications attached to the pristine blue titles my son had handed him. By early the next morning, the broker attempted to register the vehicles through his illicit channels, and the federal stolen property flag instantly locked the transaction. The broker tracked Devin down to a deserted parking lot outside a cheap diner where my son was attempting to process his collapsing reality. 3 heavily armed men blocked Devin from accessing his vehicle. The broker stepped out of a black sedan and shoved the worthless titles hard against my son's chest. He informed Devin that attempting to fence federally flagged stolen property to his syndicate was an unforgivable insult that required immediate and severe financial restitution. The broker demanded the original $70,000, returned entirely in cash, plus a massive $30,000 penalty for the extreme disrespect. He gave Devin exactly 48 hours to produce $100,000 or face immediate and permanent physical consequences. The broker made it perfectly clear that no police force and no legal maneuver could protect Devin from the violence that would follow a missed payment. Devin stood in the cracked asphalt of the parking lot, trembling uncontrollably as the black sedan drove away. He finally realized he had traded a quiet suburban life for a direct threat from ruthless men who would not hesitate to put him in an early grave over a bad business deal. While my son was being threatened in a grimy parking lot, I stood in the absolute quiet of my empty, detached garage. I held an old shop rag and slowly wiped down the oil-stained workbench where my 2 vintage cars used to sit. I had spent 10 agonizingly long years restoring those beautiful machines with my own bare hands. I hunted down original parts across the country and spent thousands of hours meticulously rebuilding the engines from blocks of rusted metal. Those cars were tangible proof of my dedication and patience. Now the concrete floor was completely bare. A younger version of myself might have raged at the profound loss of such beautiful craftsmanship. The current version of me simply folded the shop rag and placed it in the toolbox. I accepted the loss of the vehicles as a brutal but absolutely necessary sacrifice. I had to let those cars disappear into the criminal underworld to permanently dismantle my son's unearned entitlement. The heavy price of those vehicles was the exact cost required to sever the invisible safety net Devin had relied on his entire life. Devin drove his vehicle back to the sprawling suburban mansion I now secretly owned and stumbled through the front door. He found Heather aggressively packing a designer suitcase in the master bedroom, frantically trying to figure out how to salvage her rapidly dying social status. Devin collapsed onto the edge of the mattress and confessed the terrifying encounter with the underground broker. Hai explained with tears in his eyes that a violent criminal syndicate was going to severely injure him, or worse if they did not produce $100,000 in untraceable cash within 2 days. He looked at his white wife, expecting her to comfort him or offer a unified strategy to survive the crisis. Instead of supporting her husband, Heather looked down at him with absolute unmasked disgust. She was utterly repulsed by his sheer incompetence and cowardly tears. She realized her husband was not the cunning financial genius she married, but a weak man who could not even successfully execute a simple robbery. She told him he was pathetic and stormed out of the bedroom, leaving him sobbing alone. Heather had no intention of waiting around for the criminals to arrive at her doorstep. Operating entirely behind Devon's back, she reached out to her own shady contacts from her days trying to secure the black market doctor. She arranged an immediate meeting with a local and notoriously violent loan shark named Garrick. She met him in the back booth of a dimly lit tavern on the south side of town. Heather was absolutely determined to secure the funds to pay off the car broker and save her own luxurious lifestyle at any cost. She refused to lose her high society image because of her husband's monumental failures. She sat across from Garrick, a man known for breaking bones over late interest payments, and boldly requested a fast, unrecorded cash loan of $100,000. Garrick smiled a predatory smile and agreed to supply the cash by midnight, but he demanded a formal guarantor signature to secure his brutal investment. He placed a heavy stack of illicit lending contracts on the sticky table. Heather stared at the illegal contract Garrick placed in front of her. She knew that signing her own name to a loan from a violent predator would put her own physical safety directly on the line. She was far too selfish to accept that level of personal risk. With a cold and calculated swiftness, she deliberately wrote Devon's full legal name on the guarantor paperwork without his knowledge or consent. She picked up the pen and flawlessly forged her husband's signature on the dotted line. It was a moment of profound and beautiful irony. Devon had arrogantly forged my signature to steal my home and fund his wife's vanity project. Now his wife was forging his signature to bind him to a dangerous criminal underworld just to save her own skin. She handed the fraudulent document back to Garrick, binding Devon to an incredibly predatory interest rate that compounded daily. Heather felt absolutely no guilt as she traded her husband's physical safety for a duffel bag full of $100 bills. She walked out of the tavern with the cash, feeling completely justified in her betrayal. She truly believed she was simply doing whatever it took to survive the financial apocalypse I had initiated. She returned to their suburban mansion and tossed the duffel bag at Devon's feet. She coldly instructed him to take the money to the car broker and clear the immediate threat from his botched robbery. Devon looked at the cash with pure relief, completely unaware that the money he was holding had just legally transferred his soul to a loan shark. Devon followed her harsh instructions and drove straight back to the salvage yard to pay off the underground car broker before the 48-hour deadline expired. He handed over the $100,000 and believed he had finally secured his safety and narrowly escaped a violent fate. He drove back toward the suburbs, feeling a fragile sense of relief wash over his exhausted body. His false sense of security lasted exactly 20 minutes. His mobile phone rang loudly through the car speakers, displaying an unknown local number. Devon answered the call cautiously. A deep, menacing voice echoed through the vehicle. Garrick introduced himself as Devon's new primary creditor. Garrick calmly informed my son that the first exorbitant weekly interest payment of $15,000 was due on Friday at noon. Garrick owned him now. Devon parked his vehicle outside the dark shell of the warehouse district building, staring blankly at the locked glass doors of the failed spa. Before he could even turn off the ignition, two heavily built men stepped out of the shadows and blocked his driver's side door. One of the men tapped violently on the glass until Devon rolled it down with trembling hands. The enforcer did not waste time with introductions. He dropped a thick stack of stapled legal documents directly onto Devon's lap and shined a harsh tactical flashlight onto the signature line. The enforcer informed my son that his first exorbitant interest payment of $15,000 was due to Garrick by noon on Friday. Devon looked down at the paperwork in absolute confusion, swearing he had never borrowed a single dime from anyone named Garrick. The enforcer tapped the glowing flashlight against the bottom of the page, forcing Devon to look closely at the guarantor section. Devon stared at his own full legal name perfectly written on the dotted line. The ink matched his usual handwriting, but he knew with terrifying certainty that he had never held the pen. The crushing realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. His wife had deliberately forged his signature to secure a massive cash loan from a violent predator. Heather had traded his physical safety to a ruthless criminal syndicate just to save her own luxurious lifestyle. Devon sped back to the sprawling suburban mansion and stormed through the front door, his face pale and slick with cold sweat. He found Heather sitting in the living room and threw the illicit loan documents directly at her feet, screaming that she had signed his life away to a violent loan shark. I stood silently in the dark hallway of my own home, listening to their vicious argument through the speaker of the security application on my phone. Their fragile marriage was violently fracturing into jagged pieces over the very same greed that brought them together. Hearing the sheer panic in my son's voice as he realized his own spouse had fraudulently signed his name triggered a profound sense of irony within me. Devin was currently experiencing the exact terrifying betrayal and blatant forgery he had inflicted upon me just weeks prior. I was learning firsthand how it felt to have his autonomy completely stripped away and his future gambled by someone he implicitly trusted to protect him. The universe has a remarkably efficient way of balancing the scales of justice, forcing him to drink from the exact same poisoned cup he had poured for his own father. His frantic shouts of betrayal echoed through the phone speaker, creating a hollow symphony of well-deserved retribution. Consumed by an absolute blinding terror of the violent men waiting for their money, Devin realized he had no legal avenues left to secure $15,000 in cash by Friday noon. Driven by sheer desperation, he drove to the main branch of my primary financial institution the following morning, hoping to bypass the digital blocks. He marched directly up to the teller counter, his hands shaking violently as he slapped the original forged power of attorney document onto the marble surface. He demanded immediate access to my secure municipal retirement pension, claiming a catastrophic family emergency required the instant liquidation of my lifetime retirement funds. The bank teller looked at the document, typed my account information into the secure terminal, and immediately saw the flashing red federal fraud alerts, locking the entire portfolio. She politely informed Devin that the accounts were entirely frozen and that she could not authorize any withdrawals under any circumstances. Devin completely lost his composure, slamming his fists against the marble counter and loudly begging the teller to just release a fraction of the funds to save his life. He caused a massive scene in the quiet lobby, weeping openly and pleading with the security guards who approached to remove him from the premises. He shouted that he was entitled to the money, screaming that his father would want him to have it to survive this terrible ordeal. The teller remained firm, threatening to call the local police if he did not lower his voice. He was reduced to a pathetic sobbing mess, desperately trying to steal the very last drops of financial security I possessed to pay off a violent criminal he had never even met. His sheer cowardice was on full display for every single customer in the bank to witness, stripping away any remaining facade of the successful corporate businessman he had always pretended to be in front of our family. I was already sitting comfortably inside the glass-walled office of the branch manager, reviewing the updated security protocols on my accounts to ensure no further breaches could occur. I heard the loud commotion echoing through the building and walked calmly out into the main lobby. Devin stopped screaming the very second he saw me step through the heavy wooden office doors. He dropped to his knees right there on the polished tile floor, entirely abandoning whatever pride he had left in his body. He crawled toward me, grabbing the hem of my tailored suit jacket, crying and begging his father to save his life from the men who were going to kill him. He confessed everything loudly in front of the banking staff, admitting the forgery, the bribery, and the terrifying loan shark, pleading for me to just sign the release forms and give him the money. I looked down at the boy I had sacrificed 40 years of my life to protect, the boy I had worked graveyard shifts to keep safe. I felt absolutely no pity, no anger, and no sorrow. I looked at him with complete and absolute indifference, viewing him merely as a stranger facing the consequences of his own disastrous actions. I gently pulled my jacket from his desperate grip, stepped around his sobbing form, and walked out the front doors of the bank without saying a single word to him. I left him kneeling on the cold floor, surrounded by staring strangers, finally forcing him to stand entirely on his own. Devin sat weeping on the floor of the bank lobby until his mobile phone chimed with a new text message. He opened it to find a high-resolution photograph of Heather walking out of a local grocery store, taken from the dark window of a parked vehicle. The menacing message beneath the photo from Garrick simply stated that his time was officially up and the collection process would now begin. Driven to absolute madness by the imminent deadly threat hanging over his life, Devin finally realized his father was never going to swoop in and save him. He knew I kept a heavy steel floor safe, hidden deep in the back study of my house. Convinced that the safe was packed with untraceable emergency cash, Devin began plotting a violent midnight home invasion against his own father to steal his survival. I was willing to cross the ultimate line of betrayal to satisfy the violent men hunting him in the shadows. I anticipated my son's desperate escalation the moment I walked out of that bank lobby. I knew Devin was utterly cornered by Garrick and his violent associates, which meant he would inevitably return to the only well he knew how to drain. He firmly believed I kept a massive reserve of untraceable cash inside the heavy steel floor safe, bolted beneath the rug in my back study. He was entirely correct about the safe, but completely wrong about its current contents. I spent the late afternoon systematically removing my actual valuables, including my wife's antique jewelry and my physical gold reserves, and transferring them to a highly secure depository vault downtown. I left the heavy steel box sitting empty for only an hour before replacing the contents with a precisely calculated decoy. I purchased several thick bundles of high-quality counterfeit prop money used for local movie sets, wrapping the fake bills in authentic banking bands to complete the illusion. I stacked the counterfeit cash neatly inside the metal cavity. Before closing the heavy iron lid, I activated a military-grade global positioning tracker and embedded it deep inside the magnetic steel lining where it could never be easily detected. I locked the dial and rolled the rug back into place. I had successfully baited the trap. My son wanted to play the role of a ruthless criminal to save his own skin, so I was going to provide him with the exact props he needed to stage his final disastrous performance. I sat in the absolute darkness of my living room, watching the glowing screens of my security monitors illuminate the quiet space. The silence of the house weighed heavily on my chest as I stared at the infrared camera feed displaying my empty backyard. Looking at the dark perimeter brought back a vivid memory from when Devin was just 15 years old. During that summer, a sudden wave of gang violence swept through the surrounding blocks of our neighborhood. I used to sit in this exact same chair in the pitch black with a loaded shotgun resting across my lap. I sacrificed my own sleep for weeks to ensure nobody broke through those doors to harm my family. I stood as a silent, unwavering shield between my teenage son and the dangerous predators roaming the streets. Now the bitter reality was suffocating. I was sitting in the dark once again, but I was no longer guarding the perimeter against outside threats. The violent predator I was waiting for was my own flesh and blood. The boy I had protected with my life was coming to rob me blind. Just past 2 a.m, a shadow moved across the infrared camera feed covering the rear patio. I watched the screen intensely as a figure dressed in dark clothing approached the locked glass doors. The sharp, violent sound of shattering glass suddenly broke the silence of my home. Devin reached through the jagged hole, unlocked the deadbolt, and slipped into the kitchen like a common street thief. He crept through the hallways of his childhood home with a flashlight clenched in his teeth. Moving with a desperate, erratic urgency, he bypassed the living room entirely and headed straight for the back study, completely unaware that multiple high-definition motion-activated cameras were currently recording his every single movement from the ceiling corners. I watched on the monitor as he aggressively kicked the rug aside and dropped to his knees in front of the floor safe. He did not even bother trying to crack the combination lock. Devin pulled a heavy crowbar from his duffel bag and began prying the iron bolts directly out of the reinforced hardwood floor. He grunted and strained against the heavy metal, pouring every ounce of his adrenaline into ripping the security box from its foundation. The sheer physical exertion required to steal from his own father was pathetic to witness. After 20 agonizing minutes, the rusted bolts finally snapped. Devin hoisted the heavy steel safe into his arms, his face twisting in pain under the immense weight. He stumbled backward out of the study, dragging the heavy metal box across the expensive hardwood floors and leaving deep permanent scratches in the varnish. He hauled his stolen prize out through the broken patio door, entirely convinced he had just secured his salvation. He loaded the heavy safe into the trunk of his vehicle and sped off into the night, unaware that my global positioning tracker was currently transmitting his exact location directly to my mobile phone. Devin drove straight to the industrial sector of the city, delivering the stolen safe directly to a crumbling warehouse controlled by Garrick and his violent syndicate. I watched the blinking blue dot on my digital map stop moving as he proudly presented his stolen bounty to the loan shark. Inside the warehouse, Garrick ordered his heavy enforcers to take an industrial angle grinder directly to the steel hinges. Sparks flew across the dark room as they sliced the iron lid wide open. Devin smiled with sheer relief as the lid fell back, revealing the neatly stacked bundles of cash resting inside. His pathetic relief lasted less than 10 seconds. Garrick reached into the metal box, picked up a bundle of $100 bills, and immediately felt the incorrect texture of the paper. He held the counterfeit money up to the harsh overhead warehouse lights, easily spotting the bold cinematic disclaimers printed clearly across the fake currency. Garrick dropped the counterfeit cash onto the concrete floor. His fury was absolute and terrifying. He firmly believed Devon had deliberately attempted to scam a dangerous crime syndicate with Hollywood prop money. The loan shark did not yell or ask for an explanation. He simply gave his enforcers a swift nod. Two massive men grabbed Devon by his collar, slammed him against the concrete wall, and brutally beat him. Devon screamed and begged for mercy, but the violent criminals showed no restraint as they broke his ribs and shattered his arrogant facade. Garrick stood over my bleeding, broken son and casually reached into Devon's pocket to retrieve his mobile phone. The loan shark unlocked the screen using Devon's battered thumb and immediately dialed Heather's number. Heather answered the late-night call, expecting to hear her husband announce that their financial nightmare was finally over. Instead, she heard the cold, raspy voice of a furious criminal predator. Garrick informed my daughter-in-law that her husband had just insulted him by trying to pay off a legitimate blood debt with fake movie money. He demanded that Heather personally deliver the original deeds to all of her residential properties by 8 o'clock in the morning. He made it completely clear that if she failed to produce the real estate documents, her husband would not survive the week. Heather stood frozen in the center of her sprawling suburban living room, her manicured hand gripping her mobile phone so tightly her knuckles turned entirely white. The cold, raspy voice of the loan shark echoing through the speaker had just shattered her entire carefully constructed reality. Garrick did not shout or offer any room for negotiation. He calmly informed her that her husband had just insulted a dangerous criminal syndicate by attempting to pay a legitimate blood debt with counterfeit movie money. Garrick demanded that Heather personally deliver the original deeds to all of her residential properties by 8 o'clock the following morning, making it perfectly clear that Devon would not survive the week if she failed to comply. The line went dead, leaving Heather drowning in a sudden suffocating panic. She realized with absolute horror that she was entirely out of viable options. She could not surrender the deed to her own luxury mansion because the anonymous corporate holding company, which she now suspected was controlled by me, had already initiated foreclosure proceedings. Her pristine suburban fortress was completely worthless as criminal collateral. Faced with the imminent violent death of her husband and the total destruction of her high society image, Heather made a swift, ruthless calculation. She decided to sacrifice her father-in-law completely. She would surrender my historic property to the underground syndicate to save her own skin, entirely willing to throw an old man to the wolves to preserve her pathetic illusion of wealth. Heather frantically tore through the drawers of Devon's home office, tossing expensive stationery and unpaid bills across the carpet until she finally located the original forged power of attorney document. She smoothed the wrinkled paper with a frantic, desperate energy. At no point during her manic search did she shed a single tear for her husband, who was currently bleeding on the concrete floor of an industrial warehouse. She felt absolutely zero guilt over Devon's brutal fate. Her only concern was her own immediate survival and the preservation of her meticulously curated lifestyle. Her sheer entitlement was a staggering phenomenon to comprehend. She truly believed she inherently deserved the generational wealth I had built over 40 years of grueling graveyard shifts simply by virtue of marrying my son. She viewed my historic home not as a sanctuary built on black resilience and relentless sacrifice, but merely as a convenient bargaining chip to buy her way out of a violent criminal nightmare she had actively created. She shoved the fraudulent document into her designer handbag, perfectly willing to trade my entire life's work for her own personal freedom without a second thought. Shortly before dawn, Heather drove her remaining leased vehicle to a grimy 24-hour diner located on the industrial edge of the city. She walked into the neon-lit establishment, her expensive designer clothing violently contrasting with the sticky linoleum floors and the smell of stale frying oil. Garrick was already sitting in an isolated back booth, slowly stirring a cup of black coffee, while two massive enforcers stood quietly by the rear exit. Heather slid into the cracked vinyl booth across from the notorious loan shark, her hands shaking noticeably as she pulled the documents from her handbag. She did not ask about her husband's physical condition or beg for his immediate release from the warehouse. Instead, she pushed the original forged power of attorney and a certified copy of the deed to my house directly across the scratched laminate table. She looked Garrick in the eye and offered him $1 million debt-free property located in a rapidly gentrifying residential neighborhood to completely clear the $100,000 blood debt. She brazenly explained that the enclosed legal documents granted her full administrative authority to transfer the physical asset, completely omitting the critical detail that the signature was a fraudulent forgery currently flagged by federal authorities. She pitched the illegal transaction as an incredibly lucrative real estate opportunity for his underground syndicate, framing my historic home as a massive, overwhelming overpayment designed to quickly secure her own absolute freedom. She demanded that Garrick permanently sever all financial ties with her in exchange for the pristine estate, explicitly stating that whatever happened to Devon afterward was no longer her problem or concern. She sat in that greasy diner and coldly traded her marriage, her husband's physical safety, and my hard-earned generational legacy, just to ensure she could walk back into her high society circles without ever having to look over her shoulder again. Garrick stared at the desperate, privileged woman sitting across from him, entirely amused by her absolute lack of loyalty or moral compass. He picked up the forged documents, his eyes scanning the pristine signature that promised him a massive, untraceable windfall. Garrick slowly folded the forged legal documents and slid them into the interior pocket of his heavy leather jacket. He accepted the illicit real estate trade, fully intending to seize a $1 million asset to satisfy a fraction of that amount in debt. He gave Heather a dismissive wave of his hand, signaling that their immediate business transaction was officially concluded. As Heather hurried out of the diner to return to her crumbling suburban illusion, Garrick turned his attention to the two massive enforcers standing by the door. He ordered them to drive directly to my address in the quiet suburbs and forcefully remove me from the premises. He instructed his men to use whatever physical intimidation was necessary to terrify the supposedly senile old man into packing his bags and permanently vacating the property before noon. Garrick wanted the house completely empty by the time he filed the fraudulent transfer paperwork with his corrupt contacts at the county clerk's office. By accepting Heather's desperate offering, the violent loan shark was unknowingly bringing the absolute worst elements of the criminal underworld directly to my front porch. He was sending brutal predators to threaten a man who had spent decades learning exactly how to dismantle violent threats in the dark. The syndicate believed they were marching into an easy eviction, entirely unaware that they were stepping onto a heavily fortified battlefield, controlled by a tactical adversary who had already anticipated their exact arrival. I watched the live security feed on my phone as a black unmarked vehicle pulled into my driveway. The two heavy enforcers marched up my concrete walkway and began pounding violently on my solid oak front door, their heavy fists echoing like thunder through the quiet morning air. They expected to find a trembling, confused senior citizen cowering in the living room, ready to surrender his lifetime of hard work to save his own life. Instead, I calmly unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door wide open. I did not flinch. I did not retreat a single inch, and I did not reach for the telephone to call the local authorities. I looked the two dangerous criminals directly in the eye with absolute, unwavering authority. I stepped aside, gestured toward my formal dining table, and politely invited the enforcers inside my home. Before they could issue a single violent threat, I calmly instructed them to take out their mobile phones and call Garrick directly. The two massive men stared at me in complete silence for several long seconds before the larger one reached into his heavy jacket and pulled out a burner phone. He dialed a number and placed the device flat on the polished mahogany surface of my formal dining table, pressing the speakerphone button so the audio would fill the room. The raspy, aggressive voice of Garrick echoed through the quiet space, demanding to know if the eviction was already completed. I pulled out one of the heavy wooden chairs and sat down, crossing my hands over my lap before I spoke. I introduced myself to the loan shark with perfect enunciation, informing him that his men were currently standing inside my living room, but I would not be vacating the property under any circumstances. Garrick laughed a sharp, predatory sound and confidently declared that he currently held the original legal deed to my home, meaning he possessed the absolute authority to order my immediate removal. I calmly poured myself a cup of black coffee from the silver carafe resting on the table and took a slow, deliberate sip before responding. I told Garrick that the specific deed he accepted from my desperate daughter-in-law was a fully documented forgery that was currently under an active federal investigation. I strongly advised him that foolishly attempting to seize a massive $1 million property using fraudulent documents was a monumental miscalculation, bringing angry federal authorities straight to his very own front door today. The silence on the other end of the line told me my words had successfully halted his aggressive momentum. I sat quietly analyzing the criminal operating on the speakerphone using the extensive knowledge of the city power structures I had gained over several decades. Working the demanding graveyard shifts in municipal transit logistics meant I had spent endless hours observing the intricate movements of the criminal underworld that operated in the shadows of the stations. I learned exactly how violent syndicates structured their hierarchies and how aggressive street-level enforcers always answered to much larger and highly organized regional bosses. I recognized the specific cadence and bravado in Garrick's voice right away. He sounded exactly like a mid-level operator desperate to prove his worth to the powerful men sitting above him in the illicit chain of command. He projected pure terror onto vulnerable citizens to mask the fact that his implicit chain of command. He projected pure terror onto vulnerable citizens to mask the fact that his entire predatory lending operation was funded by incredibly dangerous superiors who demanded consistent returns. I knew precisely how to leverage that structural weakness against him. I possessed the absolute financial capability and the tactical patience to strip away his perceived power by directly targeting his most vital vulnerability today. I leaned slightly closer to the mobile device resting on my table and calmly informed Garrick that I was fully aware of his operation. I explained that when my son invaded my home to steal my floor safe, he unknowingly transported a military-grade tracking unit directly into the heart of the criminal operation. I clearly recited the exact geographical coordinates of the crumbling industrial warehouse where his men had foolishly cut open my decoy safe, completely exposing the hidden location of his illicit headquarters. The heavy silence filling the dining room intensified as the two enforcers standing near my entryway nervously shifted their weight. I did not stop my verbal assault there. I revealed an even more devastating financial reality to the arrogant loan shark. I informed Garrick that early this morning, I instructed my private wealth manager to quietly contact the regional syndicate boss who actively supplied the bulk capital for his street-level lending enterprise. Utilizing a small fraction of the massive liquid wealth secured within my untraceable offshore trust, I purchased his entire outstanding operational debt directly from his terrifying superiors. I paid the powerful syndicate boss in pure untraceable cash, legally acquiring every single illicit liability Garrick currently owed. I stated with absolute chilling authority that I was no longer just an innocent victim caught in the crossfire of his predatory loan. I was officially his new primary creditor. I effectively owned his entire criminal enterprise and held the absolute power to dismantle his operation or hand his location over to federal authorities with a single phone call. Garrick realized with staggering clarity that he had aggressively threatened a highly sophisticated adversary who possessed the immense resources and tactical brilliance required to ruin his life completely. He stammered over the speakerphone, his previous bravado entirely shattered by the terrifying scope of my financial retaliation. I had seamlessly turned his predatory tactics back upon him, trapping him within a crushing debt structure he could never ever escape. The arrogant street hunter had instantly and permanently become the terrified hunted target inside my own quiet house today. Garrick realized with horrifying certainty that he was entirely outmaneuvered by a man he had deeply underestimated and falsely assumed was just a helpless senior citizen. The prolonged silence emanating from the speakerphone confirmed his total submission to my newfound authority over his life and illicit business operations. I leaned back into my wooden dining chair and issued a firm, non-negotiable command that would completely shift the trajectory of his violent collection efforts. I ordered the humbled loan shark to immediately release my son Devin from the crumbling warehouse, ensuring he suffered no further physical harm from the enforcers holding him captive. I instructed Garrick to securely keep the forged power of attorney and the completely fraudulent property deed that Heather had willingly handed over at the diner, using those illicit documents as permanent, unassailable blackmail material against her. I then commanded him to divert all of his aggressive collection tactics entirely onto my deceitful daughter-in-law, effectively making her the sole target of his immense criminal frustration. I wanted Heather to endure the exact brutal nightmare she had carelessly unleashed upon her own husband, simply to save her luxurious suburban facade. I told Garrick that as long as he focused his aggressive syndicate operations exclusively on ruining Heather and stripping away every single asset she possessed, I would gladly allow his underlying debt to remain quietly unpaid. I offered him a highly lucrative alliance built entirely on mutually assured destruction and targeted vengeance against the very arrogant woman who attempted to destroy my family and my legacy forever. Garrick instantly agreed to my strict operational terms without a single moment of hesitation. He deeply understood that his physical survival completely depended on following my exact tactical commands. He immediately utilized his extensive network of illicit underworld contacts to systematically hack and permanently freeze Heather out of her own private bank accounts, leaving her utterly defenseless. He dispatched a heavily armed crew of his most ruthless men to her sprawling suburban property to forcefully seize her prized luxury vehicles right out of her concrete driveway. Heather was abruptly left completely stranded in her massive foreclosed mansion with absolutely no accessible cash, no reliable transportation, and no possible escape route. She suddenly realized the truly terrifying and devastating reality that the massive criminal violence she had so carelessly invited into her pristine life had now firmly locked its dark, inescapable sights directly onto her very own vulnerable back forever tonight. I sat in the quiet solitude of my study as Mitchell relayed the live updates of our tactical strike against my daughter-in-law. Across the city, Heather stood paralyzed behind the silk curtains of her foreclosed suburban mansion, watching through the glass as two heavily tattooed men backed a flatbed tow truck up her pristine concrete driveway. Garrick operated with a brutal efficiency that the legal system simply could not match. His enforcers did not knock or ask for permission. They breached the electronic gate, hitched the heavy steel chains to the undercarriage of her gleaming white luxury SUV, and dragged the $80,000 vehicle right off the property. Heather scrambled out the front door, shouting threats of calling the police, but the men simply flashed a copy of the forged loan document bearing her husband's name and drove away. Desperate and hyperventilating, she attempted to walk to the high-end organic grocery store a mile down the road to purchase basic necessities and formulate a plan. She filled a small basket, walked up to the cashier, and handed over her platinum credit card. The machine beeped a harsh, unforgiving red. Declined. She pulled out a second card, then a third, and finally her debit card. Every single piece of plastic was systematically rejected. The cashiers and local suburbanites stared at her with thinly veiled judgment. The crushing, suffocating reality of true poverty struck her perfectly manicured hands for the very first time in her life. Heather had painstakingly built her entire identity upon a hollow, glittering illusion of generational wealth. I remember the very day Devin brought her to our home for the first time. Diana had taken one look at the way Heather's eyes scanned our antique furniture and whispered to me that the girl was silently calculating our net worth. Heather did not marry my son out of any genuine affection or shared values. She married Devin solely because she ran the morbid mathematics of my mortality, calculating that a blue-collar transit worker with a fully paid-off estate and a hefty pension would likely suffer an early death, providing her with a massive unearned inheritance. She endured Devin's presence simply as a stepping stone to acquire the fortress I had built. Now, every single pillar of her parasitic life strategy was collapsing into dust. The wealthy socialites she desperately sought to impress were watching her public financial ruin. The luxury she felt inherently entitled to was being repossessed by violent criminals, and the quiet, unassuming black man she assumed she could easily discard was the architect of her absolute destruction. Trapped inside her dark, sprawling house, with zero access to her primary funds and a violent syndicate circling the perimeter, Heather realized the terrifying scope of her consequences. She was pinned between two inescapable fates. If she stayed in Atlanta, she faced imminent federal prison time for wire fraud and forging her husband's signature on a mob loan, or worse. She faced the brutal physical retribution of Garrick's enforcers once they realized the million-dollar deed she gave them was completely fraudulent. Survival required an immediate cowardly exit. Heather remembered a hidden commercial account she had quietly opened under a dummy corporation during the early planning stages of her wellness spa. She had secretly siphoned $20,000 of the money she originally stole from my checking account, hiding it away from Devin to pay specialized off-the-books contractors. She pulled out her laptop connected to a secure cellular hotspot to bypass the frozen home network and access the hidden digital funds. She did not hesitate to completely abandon the man she had sworn to love and protect. Heather swiftly routed the stolen $20,000 to a discreet offshore travel agency. She booked a first-class, one-way international ticket to a remote Caribbean island known for its strict non-extradition treaties with the United States government. She intended to vanish into the tropical sun, leaving Devin entirely at the mercy of both the federal fraud investigators and the ruthless loan sharks. She meticulously packed her remaining designer clothing, her expensive jewelry, and her passport into a sleek leather suitcase. She felt a profound surge of arrogant triumph, utterly convinced that she was successfully outsmarting both the criminal underworld and my calculated vengeance. She operated under the pathetic delusion that she was the smartest predator in the room, completely unaware that Mitchell and I were monitoring the digital footprint of that hidden commercial account. The very second she initiated the international wire transfer, she zipped her leather suitcase shut, fully prepared to sacrifice Devin to the wolves to guarantee her own survival. While Heather was zipping up her escape plan, the dark panel van slowed down on a desolate gravel road on the industrial outskirts of the city. The side door slid open, and two of Garrick's heavy enforcers violently kicked Devin out onto the unforgiving asphalt. My son hit the ground hard, clutching his bruised ribs and gasping for air. The van sped away, leaving him battered, broken, and completely stripped of his arrogant corporate facade. Following my strict directive, Garrick had released him alive, but left him physically shattered as a warning. Devin dragged himself up from the dirt, his expensive suit torn and stained with blood. He possessed no wallet, no mobile phone, and no dignity. He walked for 6 agonizing miles through the dark city streets, driven only by the desperate hope of reaching his suburban sanctuary to formulate a survival plan with his wife. He limped up his long concrete driveway, expecting to find Heather frantically calling the police or pacing the floors in worried tears. Instead, he pushed open the unlocked front door and staggered into the master bedroom, just as Heather was securing the final lock on her luggage. He stared at the open laptop on the bed, his swollen eyes focusing on the glaring digital confirmation of a one-way international flight. She was actively preparing to step over his bleeding body and board a plane, leaving him to take the fall for everything. He realized she was leaving him entirely defenseless against the looming criminal and federal forces. Devin leaned heavily against the bedroom doorframe, coughing up a small amount of blood, and confronted the woman he had destroyed his life to please. He begged her to stay, pleading that they could fight the charges and the syndicate together. Heather did not offer a single ounce of comfort. She looked at his bruised, pathetic form with absolute revulsion. She coldly admitted that she had never loved him for a single second. She called him a pathetic, spineless failure who could not even successfully steal from a senile old man. She stated that he was completely useless to her now that the money was gone. Heather grabbed the handle of her sleek leather suitcase, stepped right over his bleeding body on the carpet, and walked out the front door. She hailed a passing cab and headed straight to the international airport, believing she had won. Heather arrived at the bustling international terminal of the Atlanta airport with her sleek leather suitcase gliding smoothly across the polished terrazzo floor. She moved through the crowded ticketing line with an aura of arrogant confidence radiating from her every deliberate step. She truly believed she had successfully outsmarted every single obstacle placed in her path. In her deeply narcissistic mind, she had masterfully orchestrated a flawless escape from the collapsing ruins of her suburban life. She felt absolutely no remorse for leaving her brutally beaten husband bleeding on the floor of their foreclosed mansion to take the entire fall for the violent criminal syndicate. She operated under the pathetic delusion that the $20,000 she had secretly transferred to her offshore accounts guaranteed her a fresh start on a sun-drenched island far beyond the reach of the United States justice system. She adjusted her designer sunglasses and smiled at the glowing departure screens, entirely convinced that she was the smartest predator to ever play the game. She completely underestimated the quiet patience of a man who had spent 40 years learning how to build unbreakable systems. She assumed she was walking toward her ultimate liberation, completely unaware that she was marching directly into the center of a perfectly calibrated federal trap. I had been watching her digital footprint for hours, tracking her every movement with absolute precision. She thought she was running away from her consequences, but she was actually delivering herself right into my waiting hands. I sat quietly inside the brightly lit office of Detective Miller at the downtown police precinct while Heather stood in the airport queue. I placed a thick, immaculate folder of consolidated financial documentation directly onto his metal desk. The file contained irrefutable proof of the forged wire transfers and the exact routing numbers for her hidden commercial accounts. Detective Miller asked me why I did not simply have her arrested the moment she stole the funds from my checking account weeks ago. I looked at the seasoned detective and explained that executing true justice requires immense discipline and tactical patience. Growing up in a deeply segregated city, I learned very early that a black man cannot afford to make rash emotional decisions when dealing with legal authorities. I needed to ensure that her punishment was absolute and inescapable. If I had reported the initial theft, she might have negotiated a plea deal for a minor state-level misdemeanor. By waiting patiently for her to attempt to flee across international borders using stolen corporate funds, I elevated her crimes to severe federal offenses. I wanted her trapped by the highest authorities in the nation. Heather approached the first-class ticketing counter and handed her pristine blue passport to the airline agent with a dismissive wave of her hand. She expected to be swiftly ushered toward a luxury departure lounge where she could drink champagne and celebrate her brilliant escape. Instead, the agent scanned her document and immediately stared at a flashing red security alert dominating the computer screen. The agent politely asked Heather to wait for just a moment, claiming a minor system error required supervisor approval. Heather sighed loudly, shifting her weight and complaining about the unacceptable delay, entirely oblivious to the silent alarms echoing through the airport security network. Less than 2 minutes later, the heavy glass doors behind the ticketing counter swung open. Two heavily armed agents from the Transportation Security Administration, alongside a stern federal marshal, approached her directly from behind. The federal marshal firmly placed his hand on her shoulder and instructed her to step away from the counter immediately. Heather spun around, her arrogant facade instantly cracking as she demanded to know the meaning of this outrageous interruption. The marshal did not lower his voice or offer any gentle courtesies. He publicly informed her that the $20,000 she had just attempted to wire to an offshore account was officially flagged as stolen investor funds connected to a massive federal fraud investigation. He stated clearly that her passport was temporarily suspended and she was legally barred from boarding any international or domestic flight. The surrounding passengers stopped and stared as the marshal seized her designer suitcase and her travel documents. Heather tried to protest, arguing that she was a wealthy business owner taking a planned vacation, but her words faltered under the crushing weight of federal authority. Her brilliant escape plan had instantly transformed into a humiliating public spectacle right in the middle of the crowded terminal. The agents escorted her away from the ticketing area, guiding her toward a secure interrogation room hidden deep within the airport infrastructure. The sterile white walls of the airport holding room offered absolutely no comfort to my terrified daughter-in-law. Heather paced the small windowless space in a state of sheer breathless panic, as the reality of her federal detention crushed the last remnants of her arrogance. The federal marshal confiscated her personal belongings, but informed her she was legally permitted to make one single phone call before they formally transferred her to a federal holding facility downtown. Completely stripped of her luxury and facing decades in a federal penitentiary, she made a highly predictable and entirely cowardly decision. She grabbed the metal receiver of the wall-mounted telephone and dialed her husband. She desperately needed a scapegoat to absorb the devastating legal consequences of her actions. When Devin answered the line, Heather immediately burst into loud theatrical tears, fabricating a masterclass in emotional manipulation. She wept uncontrollably, begging Devin to immediately drive to the police precinct and formally confess to orchestrating the entire financial fraud operation by himself. She pleaded with him to take full responsibility for forging my signature on the loan documents, claiming that his sacrifice was the only way to save her from going to prison. She promised him she would wait for him and hire the best lawyers to reduce his sentence, actively exploiting his lingering emotional attachment to secure her own absolute freedom. She told him that true love required this sacrifice, completely ignoring the fact that she had abandoned him, bleeding on their bedroom floor just hours ago. Devin was not sitting in their foreclosed suburban mansion, eagerly waiting to rescue his treacherous wife. My son was sitting directly across from me, inside the secure office of Detective Miller at the downtown police precinct. His mobile phone rested flat on the metal desk, with the speakerphone activated, projecting Heather's manipulative lies clearly across the quiet room. Devin stared at the glowing screen with hollow, bruised eyes, finally hearing the absolute venom and profound selfishness hiding beneath her fake tears. He realized with crushing certainty that she viewed his life as completely disposable. He looked up from the phone and met my stoic gaze, seeking a shred of the paternal protection he had so carelessly discarded. I offered him nothing but cold silence. Devin slowly turned to Detective Miller and firmly agreed to wear a hidden wire to destroy her completely. Detective Miller stood in the sterile observation room of the airport security annex and threaded a tiny microphone wire beneath the collar of my son's torn and blood-stained shirt. Devin sat on the metal folding chair, looking utterly hollowed out by the events of the past 48 hours. His jaw was heavily bruised from the savage beating he took at the hands of the loan shark enforcers, and his posture was completely defeated. I stood in the adjacent room, watching his pathetic submission through the two-way glass mirror. I offered absolutely no words of comfort to the boy I had raised. I did not tap on the glass or offer a sympathetic nod to reassure him. This was the exact bed my son had violently made for himself, and now he was forced to lie in it without the safety net of my protection. He had willingly chosen to align himself with a treacherous woman and ruthless criminals to steal my generational wealth. Now he had to face the brutal mechanics of the federal justice system to salvage whatever miserable fraction of his life remained. Detective Miller tested the audio frequency on his digital receiver and gave Devin a stern nod of confirmation. The detective explicitly instructed my son to keep his volatile emotions entirely in check and simply let his desperate wife do all the talking. Devin slowly stood up from the metal chair looking like a condemned prisoner, taking his final walk toward the execution chamber. I watched my son stare at his own battered reflection in the two-way glass for a long moment before he turned away. Through the audio feed transmitting directly into my earpiece, I could hear the heavy, erratic rhythm of his breathing. I knew exactly what was finally processing through his fractured mind. Growing up, Devin constantly rebelled against the rigid discipline I enforced inside our home. He infrequently accused me of being far too strict and unyielding whenever I demanded accountability for his reckless teenage mistakes. He had spent his entire adult life viewing my firm boundaries as a form of paternal cruelty. Standing in that cold federal holding facility, he finally realized that my relentless discipline was the only thing actively shielding him from the unforgiving predators of the real world. I had tried to build the structural fortitude within his character to prevent this exact manifestation of weakness. He recognized with absolute clarity that he had foolishly thrown away a deeply devoted father simply to appease the insatiable vanity of a profoundly toxic wife. He had traded a lifetime of unconditional security for a fleeting illusion of high society status. Devin pushed open the heavy steel door of the primary interrogation room and stepped inside. Heather was pacing the small concrete space like a trapped animal, her expensive designer travel clothing looking ridiculously out of place against the drab institutional walls. The very second she laid eyes on her bleeding husband, she completely ignored his visible physical injuries. She did not ask him if he was in pain or how he had managed to escape the violent syndicate. Instead, she immediately launched into a masterful display of predatory emotional manipulation. She rushed forward and grabbed his bruised arms, crying loud theatrical tears while weaving a deeply calculated narrative. Heather urgently demanded that Devin sit down and listen to her exact legal instructions. She outlined a highly specific and entirely fabricated confession that she needed him to memorize and recite to the federal marshals. She brazenly admitted over the hidden wire that she was the one who physically forged my signature on the primary power of attorney documents to secure the fraudulent commercial loan for her wellness spa. She explicitly told him that because the illegal loan was technically acquired under his name, he needed to take the sole blame for the entire financial scheme. She spun a sickening web of deception, claiming that if he confessed to orchestrating the forgery without her knowledge, she could walk free and hire a top-tier defense team to reduce his inevitable prison sentence. She desperately tried to convince the man she had just abandoned that taking the full federal fall was the ultimate display of a husband's unconditional devotion. She held his hands and promised him a fresh start on a tropical island, once the legal dust settled, completely ignoring the fact that she had just tried to board a one-way international flight without him. I stood behind the glass, listening to her weave her toxic lies, marveling at the sheer depth of her narcissistic delusion. She genuinely believed her charm could override his instinct for self-preservation. Devin swallowed hard and followed Detective Miller's exact prior instructions. He forced his voice to sound thoroughly defeated and deliberately pressed his wife for more specific details regarding their various crimes. He asked her to explicitly clarify how they were going to explain the missing money to the federal authorities. Heather eagerly took the bait and completely incriminated herself on the digital recording. She loudly detailed exactly how she arranged the illegal bribes with the city plumbing inspector to secure her fraudulent building permits. She openly bragged about leveraging her own suburban mortgage to pay the black market doctor to fabricate fake medical records intended to have me locked away in a psychiatric ward. She proudly listed every single illegal maneuver she had executed to siphon the stolen loan money into her hidden offshore accounts. Empowered by the sound of her own arrogant voice, Heather began to boast about how incredibly easy it had been to trick me out of my life savings. She laughed a cruel, hollow sound in the stark interrogation room and called me a pathetic, senile old man who was too stupid to realize his entire legacy was being systematically dismantled right under his nose. She confidently declared that a working-class transit employee never deserved to possess that level of generational wealth in the first place. She firmly stated that she was simply rectifying a cosmic mistake by redirecting my hard-earned assets into the hands of a woman who truly knew how to appreciate luxury. She was handing the federal prosecutors an absolute masterpiece of recorded criminal evidence. Devin sat in silence as she finished her arrogant monologue. Then Heather leaned closer to his face and dropped one final devastating secret that had absolutely nothing to do with the stolen money. She smugly admitted that 5 years ago, she was the one who deliberately poured toxic bleach into the soil of my late wife Diana's prized backyard rose garden. She destroyed the only living memory I had left of my wife, simply out of pure spite, because I had refused to pay for her lavish destination wedding. It was the ultimate unforgivable disrespect. Hearing that specific confession through my earpiece extinguished the last remaining atom of mercy in my soul. I looked at Detective Miller and gave him a single sharp nod. The detective did not hesitate. He signaled his tactical team, and 3 heavily armed federal agents immediately stormed through the interrogation room door. The heavy steel door flew open and slammed against the concrete block wall with a deafening crack. 3 federal agents flooded the small interrogation room, their tactical gear a stark contrast to the sterile environment. The lead agent did not offer Heather a single moment to process the sudden intrusion. He stepped directly into her personal space, grabbed her wrists, and swiftly pulled them behind her back. He loudly read her Miranda rights, officially placing her under arrest for federal wire fraud, aggravated elder abuse, criminal conspiracy, and multiple counts of forgery. The cold, metallic click of the heavy handcuffs echoing in the small room completely shattered the fragile illusion of her high society life. Heather gasped, her eyes darting frantically around the room, until they landed on the small black wire taped beneath the torn collar of Devon's blood-stained shirt. Her face twisted into a mask of absolute unhinged fury. She began screaming at the top of her lungs, thrashing against the firm grip of the federal agents. She hurled every vicious insult she could muster at her husband, shrieking that he was a cowardly traitor who had ruined her perfect future. The agents simply tightened their hold and forcefully marched her toward the exit. She dragged her expensive designer heels across the scuffed linoleum floor, her arrogant facade entirely dismantled and replaced by the pathetic, primal panic of a predator finally caught in a steel trap. I stood perfectly still in the dimly lit observation hallway, watching the chaotic scene unfold through the thick glass of the two-way mirror. The confession Heather had just dropped, regarding the deliberate destruction of Diana's prized backyard rose garden, echoed relentlessly inside my head. After Diana passed away from her long battle with illness, tending to those vibrant red roses was the only physical connection I had left to the woman I loved. When the roots suddenly withered and died 5 years ago, I blamed myself for failing to maintain the delicate soil balance. Learning that Heather had intentionally poured toxic bleach over those beautiful flowers out of pure childish spite over a destination wedding extinguished the very last lingering atom of mercy residing anywhere in my soul. I felt no lingering pity as the federal marshals dragged her kicking and screaming past the observation window. I watched her perfectly manicured life dissolve into absolute ruin without a single flinch. My face remained a mask of stone as her desperate cries faded down the long institutional corridor. The vindication I felt was a cold, necessary comfort required to properly close this incredibly dark chapter. The interrogation room grew completely silent once the heavy door clicked shut behind the federal agents. Devon sat alone at the metal table, his shoulders slumped and his bruised face buried in his shaking hands. I slowly opened the side door and stepped into the room. Devon looked up at me, his eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic hope. He truly believed that his last-minute cooperation with law enforcement had miraculously absolved him of his massive betrayals. He attempted to stand up, reaching his trembling hand out toward me, fully expecting the unconditional paternal forgiveness I had freely given him his entire life. I stopped just out of his reach and looked down at him with absolute indifference. I informed my son in a low, steady voice that wearing a hidden wire for a few minutes did not magically erase the fact that he stole $85,000 from my checking account. I reminded him that his cooperation did not reverse the forged signatures, the illegal municipal bribes, or the immense disrespect he showed toward the legacy Diana and I had built from nothing. I coldly stated that a single act of self-preservation does not rewrite a profound history of treacherous greed. Devon lowered his hand, the foolish hope instantly draining from his battered face as the grim reality of his situation finally took hold. Detective Miller walked into the room, holding a second pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The detective ordered Devon to stand up and place his hands behind his back. Devon openly wept as Miller formally arrested him for his active role in the municipal bribery and the grand theft associated with the fraudulent commercial wellness spa. I stood silently in the corner of the concrete room and watched the detective secure the metal cuffs tightly around my son's wrists. He looked back at me one final time, begging for a lifeline that no longer existed. I simply turned my back and walked out of the door, Devin was immediately transported and processed into the bleak, overcrowded holding cells of the county jail. The sterile, unforgiving environment of the penal system offered a brutal contrast to the sprawling suburban mansion he had foolishly traded his morality to maintain. As he surrendered his torn, tailored clothes for a harsh orange jumpsuit, the true magnitude of his complete financial and social destruction finally crushed his spirit. He sat on a thin, rigid mattress in a noisy concrete cell, entirely isolated from the luxurious world he had arrogantly believed he commanded. He had absolutely nothing left to his name. The massive suburban house was legally seized by my corporate holding company. His treacherous wife was locked in a separate federal detention center, actively preparing to blame him for every single crime. His commercial wellness spa was permanently shut down by the city inspector board. His personal bank accounts were completely frozen by federal fraud alerts. The dangerous loan shark syndicate still held a massive blood debt against his forged name. Most devastating of all, he had permanently severed the unconditional bond with the only father who had ever truly loved him. The heavy iron bars of his cell represented the absolute boundary of his ruined life, a cold cage built entirely by his own unhinged greed. Just 2 days after the airport arrests, Bradley requested an urgent meeting at his downtown law firm. I arrived to find him reviewing a highly aggressive legal correspondence. Heather had managed to secure a notoriously ruthless, high-priced defense attorney using funds funneled from her wealthy parents. Her new legal counsel immediately contacted Bradley with a vicious ultimatum. The defense attorney explicitly threatened to launch a brutal, highly public smear campaign in open court, intending to paint me as a controlling, abusive patriarch suffering from severe dementia. They promised to drag my entire family legacy through the mud unless I immediately dropped all the pending civil charges and unfroze her remaining assets. They foolishly believed they could intimidate a man who had already stripped them of their power. The quiet tactical warfare was officially over, and the final battle was rapidly shifting directly to the unforgiving floor of the federal courtroom. Bradley arrived at my home early the next morning with a heavy briefcase and a deeply concerning update regarding the upcoming federal proceedings. We sat in my study as he outlined the vicious legal strategy Heather and her expensive defense attorney were preparing to unleash in open court. They fully intended to portray me as a controlling, highly abusive patriarch who was currently suffering from severe and rapidly advancing dementia. Her lawyer planned to argue before a federal judge that Heather and Devin never actually stole the $85,000 from my checking account. Instead, they were going to spin a completely fabricated narrative claiming they only moved the money to protect my assets from my own cognitive decline. They wanted to convince the jury that their fraudulent commercial wellness spa was actually a legitimate family investment designed to generate passive income for my long-term medical care. Heather was actively attempting to paint herself as a deeply devoted daughter-in-law who was forced to make difficult financial decisions to save a sick old man from ruining his own legacy. She genuinely believed she could manipulate the justice system by weaponizing my age against my credibility. She wanted to frame my calculated retaliation as the erratic, paranoid delusions of a failing mind. Bradley warned me that her defense team would be absolutely ruthless during the pre-trial deposition, seeking any possible opportunity to provoke an emotional outburst to validate their false narrative. I spent the entire weekend meticulously preparing my testimony and reviewing decades of immaculate financial records I had stored inside my safe. I arranged every single bank statement, property tax receipt, and pension payout into chronological order with absolute precision. Looking at those documents reminded me of the relentless discipline I had to maintain to survive as a black man working within a municipal transit structure that was inherently designed to see me fail. I had to be twice as sharp and work 3 times as hard just to secure the exact same promotions as my white colleagues. I spent 40 years carefully documenting every single professional action I took to protect myself from false accusations and administrative sabotage in the workplace. That lifetime of forced hypervigilance had forged my mind into an unbreakable steel trap. I refused to let an arrogant, greedy daughter-in-law rewrite my personal history or diminish my lifelong sacrifices. I was not going to allow her to erase my decades of grueling hard work by slapping a convenient medical label on my fully justified vengeance in a court of law to save herself from federal prison. The pre-trial deposition took place inside a sterile, windowless conference room at the federal courthouse later that week. Heather sat across the long mahogany table, wearing a highly conservative gray suit, completely abandoning her usual high society glamour to meticulously play the role of an exhausted, deeply concerned caregiver. Her defense attorney, a sharp and incredibly aggressive man in a tailored pinstripe suit, immediately launched into a brutal verbal interrogation designed to completely shatter my composure. He paced heavily around the room, loudly questioning my daily memory recall and actively trying to bait me into a loud defensive anger. He asked me repeatedly if I frequently forgot where I placed my personal belongings, or if I ever experienced sudden bouts of unwarranted physical aggression toward my loving family members. He spoke to me with a dripping, calculated condescension, intentionally trying to provoke the exact type of erratic emotional outbursts that would perfectly support their entirely fabricated dementia defense. I did not give him a single inch of satisfaction or validation. I remained terrifyingly calm throughout the entire ordeal, sitting with perfect rigid posture and answering every single aggressive question with a cold, robotic precision. When he asked about the missing funds, I did not just confirm the overall amount. I recited the exact calendar date, the precise minute. The wire transfer cleared, the specific routing numbers of her hidden commercial account, and the exact checking balance remaining down to the very last cent. I effortlessly listed the chronological sequence of their loan fraud, providing the exact dates the forged power of attorney was illegally notarized and submitted to the bank for the massive equity line. My absolute lack of emotion and my flawless articulation deeply unnerved the defense attorney. He realized very quickly that he was not interrogating a confused senior citizen prone to cognitive lapses. I was facing a highly tactical adversary who possessed a completely flawless encyclopedic recall of every single financial transaction they committed against my estate over the course of the entire year. The defense attorney became visibly frustrated by my impenetrable demeanor. He slammed his hands onto the mahogany table and demanded to know why I had suddenly become so dangerously paranoid and vindictive toward the very people trying to manage my failing health. That was the exact moment I calmly signaled Bradley to deliver the final crushing blow. Bradley smoothly opened his leather briefcase and pulled out the official notarized medical affidavit I had secured from the chief of neurology just weeks prior. He slid the pristine document across the table directly into the hands of the arrogant defense attorney. I watched the color drain entirely from the lawyer's face as his eyes rapidly scanned the heavy parchment paper bearing the official hospital crest. The comprehensive psychiatric and cognitive evaluation explicitly proved my absolute mental clarity, completely destroying the foundation of their entire legal strategy in a matter of seconds. The medical record was entirely unassailable, backed by the highest neurological authority in the state of Georgia. It formally certified that my cognitive function was superior to men decades younger, rendering their claims of dementia legally useless and highly libelous. The defense attorney slowly lowered the document, realizing his wealthy client had blatantly lied to him about my mental vulnerability. Heather stared at the paper in absolute horror, her face twisting in sheer panic as she finally understood that her carefully constructed medical trap had been preemptively and permanently dismantled long before she even entered the room to testify against me in front of the federal judge. The total collapse of the dementia defense left Heather entirely exposed to the severe federal wire fraud and forgery charges. Realizing she could no longer use my age to escape a lengthy prison sentence, her inherent selfishness instantly took full control. She made a swift, ruthless calculation right there in the conference room. Heather completely abandoned her unified defense strategy and decided to turn on her husband entirely. She instructed her attorney to drastically pivot their narrative, officially claiming that Devin was the sole criminal mastermind behind the entire operation. She shamelessly declared that she was actually a battered, deeply terrified wife who was violently forced to comply with his elaborate financial schemes under the constant threat of physical harm. She was fully prepared to portray the man she married as a violent monster just to secure her own freedom today. The federal trial opened on a crisp Tuesday morning inside the grand mahogany walls of the downtown courthouse. The gallery was packed tightly with curious spectators, local reporters, and legal aides eager to witness the highly publicized proceedings. Heather sat at the primary defense table, meticulously dressed in a modest beige suit that was deliberately chosen to make her appear small and entirely unthreatening. She kept her head bowed low, crying softly on command and continuously dabbing her dry eyes with a white tissue to play the role of the innocent, victimized wife. She desperately wanted the jury to believe she was a terrified woman trapped by a domineering husband. Devin sat at a completely separate defense table just a few feet away, flanked by his court-appointed public defender. My son looked utterly hollowed out, a mere ghost of the arrogant businessman who had stood in my living room months ago. His posture was severely slumped, his shoulders rounding inward as he stared blankly at the polished wooden table in front of him. The severe physical and emotional beating he took from the loan shark and the brutal reality of his incarceration had completely shattered his arrogant spirit. He offered no resistance and mounted no theatrical performance for the judge. The two of them were completely divided, their toxic alliance shattered the moment the federal indictments were handed down. I sat in the second row of the gallery, maintaining my rigid posture and observing the highly performative nature of the American justice system. As a black man who grew up navigating a society that often weaponized the law against people who looked like me, I knew that courtroom victories were rarely won on mere emotion or righteous indignation. They were won through cold, undeniable evidence and relentless preparation. I watched the expensive defense attorneys strut across the carpet, fully aware they were paid to spin elaborate fictions to save their guilty clients. I did not let their theatrical tactics unnerve me. I grounded my mind entirely in the massive, indisputable paper trail I had spent weeks meticulously building alongside Bradley and Mitchell. I knew every single bank routing number, every forged signature date, and every offshore wire transfer receipt that was currently sitting inside the prosecutor's heavy evidence boxes. The defense could try to twist the narrative, but they could never erase the absolute permanence of the financial mathematics we had securely locked into the federal record. The lead federal prosecutor stepped up to the podium and wasted absolutely no time dismantling the fragile illusion Heather was desperately trying to project. He did not begin with complex financial jargon or lengthy witness testimonies. Instead, he simply introduced the digital wiretap recording acquired during the airport sting operation. He pressed a button on his laptop and the crisp, high-definition audio of Heather's voice instantly echoed through the massive courtroom speakers. The jury listened in stunned silence as the recording played her arrogant, venomous monologue from the holding room. They heard her proudly outline exactly how she personally forged my signature on the initial power of attorney documents to secure the massive commercial loan. They heard the sheer unhinged greed in her tone as she laughed about bribing city officials and stealing my lifetime savings to fund her luxury wellness spa. The most devastating moment occurred when the audio captured her viciously mocking me, calling me a pathetic, senile old man who was too stupid to realize his generational wealth was being stolen. The stark contrast between the arrogant, cruel predator on the recording and the weeping, fragile woman sitting at the defense table was instantly jarring. The 12 members of the jury shifted in their seats, their faces hardening with visible disgust as they looked directly at her. Heather stopped dabbing her eyes with the tissue, her fake tears abruptly drying up as she realized her masterful performance was completely destroyed by the sound of her own voice. The defense attorney closed his eyes and pinched the bridge of his nose, knowing the audio evidence was utterly devastating to their battered wife narrative. She had boldly confessed her crimes into a hidden microphone, sealing her own fate with her profound vanity. The entire courtroom recognized her for exactly what she was. She was a ruthless, calculating thief who felt absolutely zero remorse for destroying a family to maintain her high society facade. The prosecution then called their key witness to the stand. Devin slowly stood up from his table, raised his right hand to take the binding oath, and sat heavily in the wooden witness box. He did not look at me in the gallery, nor did he look at the woman he had married. Guided by the federal prosecutor, my son proceeded to lay out the entire criminal operation, from beginning to end in a flat, monotonous voice. He accepted his own undeniable guilt for the bribery and the theft, offering no excuses for his catastrophic failures. However, he meticulously ensured that Heather could not escape her equal share of the blame. He testified under oath that it was her explicit idea to drain my checking account immediately after the family reunion. He exposed the terrifying reality of the local loan shark, Garrick, detailing how Heather deliberately forged his signature on the illicit underworld contract to secure the cash she needed to save herself. He described the moment he walked into their master bedroom bleeding from a brutal beating, only to find her packing a designer suitcase with stolen corporate funds, fully prepared to flee to a non-extradition island and leave him to die at the hands of violent men. He methodically dismantled her entire defense strategy, leaving her completely exposed to the absolute harshest penalties of the federal justice system. His testimony was the final nail in the coffin of their disastrous marriage, a bitter end to a union built entirely on greed. Heather's high-priced defense attorney realized his entire strategy was rapidly collapsing into ash. The wiretap audio and Devin's brutal testimony had painted his client into an inescapable corner of federal guilt. Desperate to salvage the case and inject reasonable doubt into the minds of the jury, the defense decided to deploy a highly aggressive and incredibly risky final maneuver. He stood up, smoothed his tailored suit jacket, and officially called me to the witness stand. He intended to subject me to a vicious hostile cross-examination right there in open court. It was a calculated last-ditch effort to publicly rattle me, hoping to destroy my credibility and validate their shattered narrative in front of the judge. He believed he could break my composure and portray me as the villain of this story. He was about to make a monumental mistake. I stepped forward when the bailiff called my name and placed my right hand firmly on the polished wooden rail of the witness stand. I took the binding oath with a clear and unwavering voice, swearing to tell the absolute truth before the federal judge and the captivated gallery. As I sat down in the heavy leather chair, Heather's highly paid defense attorney immediately began pacing across the carpeted floor like a cornered predator. He launched into his aggressive cross-examination without offering a single formal pleasantry. He desperately attempted to frame my calculated retrieval of my stolen assets as a vindictive and entirely illegal personal vendetta. He raised his voice, pointing an accusatory finger in my direction, and suggested to the jury that I had maliciously orchestrated a cruel trap designed to ruin my innocent daughter-in-law. He painted a completely fabricated picture of a wealthy, controlling patriarch who ruthlessly punished a minor family misunderstanding with disproportionate financial violence. He demanded to know if I felt any remorse for systematically stripping a young suburban couple of their home, their commercial business, and their basic livelihood. I sat perfectly still under the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom, maintaining my stoic composure as his theatrical accusations echoed against the mahogany walls. I did not let his aggressive volume intimidate me or break my steady gaze. I waited for him to finish his dramatic performance before leaning toward the microphone to deliver my response. I completely ignored the pacing defense attorney and turned my body to speak directly to the 12 members of the jury. I stripped away the complex legal jargon and focused entirely on the raw, undeniable reality of my life. I explained to them the profound value of a single dollar earned through 40 grueling years of working the graveyard shift at the Municipal Transit Authority. I described the physical toll of scrubbing black grease from my hands every morning just to ensure my family had a secure roof over their heads and food on their table. I articulated that the wealth I meticulously built was not a massive corporate trust fund, but a sacred generational legacy secured through literal blood, sweat, and endless sacrifice. I told the jury that the true crime committed here was not just a matter of forged banking documents or stolen commercial real estate. It was a fundamental, devastating betrayal of sacred family trust. I looked at the diverse faces in the jury box and explained how deeply it shatters a father to realize his lifelong sacrifices were viewed by his own flesh and blood merely as a convenient piggy bank waiting to be violently smashed open. The defense attorney scoffed loudly at my heartfelt testimony and aggressively stepped right up to the edge of the wooden witness box. He sneered and directly asked if I had maliciously entrapped my family by intentionally purchasing their debts and silently pushing them into a desperate corner just to watch them suffer. I leaned forward into the microphone and verbally dismantled his entire pathetic argument piece by piece. I stated with absolute, chilling clarity that I did not force my son to trace and forge my signature on official banking documents. I did not force them to steal $85,000 from my personal checking account to fund a fraudulent luxury wellness spa. I reminded the silent courtroom that I never instructed Devin to hand a thick envelope of illicit bribe money to a municipal plumbing inspector in broad daylight. Furthermore, I explicitly pointed out that I certainly did not force Heather to secretly meet with a notoriously violent underground loan shark or illegally forge her own husband's signature on a predatory criminal contract just to save her high society facade. I told the stuttering attorney that I did not manufacture a single crime they willingly committed. I explained to the captivated jury that my only action was permanently removing the invisible financial safety net they had blindly relied upon their entire privileged lives. I simply allowed their inherent unhinged greed to run its natural disastrous course, without stepping in to rescue them from the brutal consequences of their own malicious choices. I firmly declared that holding treacherous adults legally and financially accountable for multiple federal felonies is not illegal entrapment. It is the absolute uncompromising definition of justice. The defense attorney stood completely frozen in front of the witness box, entirely unable to counter the flawless, irrefutable logic of my testimony. His aggressive momentum was permanently shattered by the sheer undeniable weight of their monumental guilt. To permanently seal the total destruction of their defense, I reached into the interior breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I pulled out the original printed bank receipt documenting the exact $85,000 unauthorized wire transfer that initiated this entire federal nightmare. I held the crisp paper high in the air so the presiding judge, the attentive jury, and the packed gallery could clearly see the undeniable genesis of their monumental fraud. I looked directly at Heather, who was currently shrinking down into her wooden chair at the defense table, completely stripped of her previous suburban arrogance. I brought the story completely full circle for the silent courtroom. I repeated the exact vicious words she had spoken to me in my kitchen, while casually holding a glass of my expensive vintage champagne. I told the jury that when I confronted my daughter-in-law about draining my life savings, she laughed directly in my face with pure, unadulterated entitlement. I spoke into the microphone, my voice echoing with profound finality. She looked at me and said they needed it more. She genuinely believed her selfish desire for a luxury commercial wellness spa entirely superseded my 40 years of grueling manual labor. I slowly lowered the banking receipt and let my cold gaze sweep across the 12 attentive jurors. I did not steal a single thing from them. I simply proved to them what actual, terrifying need truly looks like when the stolen money finally runs dry. The defense attorney realized he had completely lost control of the narrative and hastily ended his disastrous cross-examination. He formally rested his case, slumping into his chair next to a visibly trembling Heather. The federal judge delivered his final comprehensive instructions to the jury before dismissing them to begin their closed deliberations. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom shut tightly behind the 12 men and women who now held the absolute fate of my son and daughter-in-law in their hands. A thick, suffocating tension immediately settled over the massive room as the agonizing wait began. Every single person in the gallery sat in hushed, anxious silence. We were all completely anchored to our seats, bracing for the final, inescapable legal judgment that would permanently define the future of the two treacherous antagonists who tried to ruin my life. The federal jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before officially notifying the bailiff that they had reached a unanimous decision. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open and the 12 men and women filed back into the jury box with solemn, unreadable expressions. A thick, suffocating tension enveloped the grand mahogany room as the foreperson handed the sealed envelope to the court clerk. Heather sat rigidly at the defense table, her perfectly manicured hands trembling violently as the federal judge unfolded the heavy paper. The judge adjusted his reading glasses and read the binding verdicts directly into the microphone. On the severe federal charges of wire fraud, aggravated elder abuse, and criminal conspiracy, the jury found Heather completely guilty on all counts. A sharp gasp escaped her lips, echoing loudly in the absolute silence of the courtroom. The judge then turned to the secondary list of federal indictments. On the charges of document forgery and municipal bribery, the jury found my son Devin unequivocally guilty. Devin did not gasp or cry out. He simply stared down at his handcuffed wrists, finally crushed under the monumental weight of his own disastrous arrogance. The sheer speed of the deliberation proved that the jury saw straight through Heather's fabricated tears and Devin's cowardly excuses. The absolute permanence of the financial mathematics we had securely locked into the federal record had completely destroyed their pathetic illusions of innocence. The presiding federal judge did not wait to schedule a separate hearing for the official sentencing. He looked down from his elevated judicial bench with an expression of profound disgust, fixing his stern, unforgiving gaze directly upon my daughter-in-law. He delivered a scathing admonishment, publicly tearing apart her profound lack of basic human morality and her highly predatory sense of entitlement. He stated that in his 30 years on the federal bench, he had rarely witnessed such a calculated, venomous betrayal of familial trust driven entirely by shallow vanity. I sat quietly in the second row of the gallery, maintaining my rigid posture and listening to the harsh gavel of justice fall. I felt absolutely no joy or triumphant celebration in my heart. Watching my only son face a lengthy federal prison sentence brought back a sharp, agonizing memory of holding him as a newborn in the hospital ward, promising to protect him from the harshness of the world. Now I was the direct architect of his total ruin. Yet I felt the heavy, undeniable satisfaction of a necessary brutal surgery successfully completed. The cancerous rot that actively threatened to consume my generational legacy had been permanently and methodically excised. The judge struck his wooden gavel against the sounding block and delivered the final, inescapable mandates. He sentenced Heather to 12 consecutive years in a maximum securities federal penitentiary without the slightest possibility of early parole. He cited her active role as the primary architect of the financial conspiracy and her complete lack of remorse as the primary factors for the maximum penalty. He then turned his attention to Devin, sentencing my son to 7 years in federal prison for his active complicity in the municipal bribery and document forgery. The visceral reaction inside the courtroom was instantaneous and utterly chaotic. 2 armed federal marshals immediately stepped forward, grabbing Heather firmly by the arms to remand her directly into permanent state custody. She thrashed violently against their firm grip, her polite facade completely shattering as she screamed wildly at the judge, at her silent defense attorney, and finally at me. She shrieked that she did not belong in a concrete cell, desperately clinging to the delusion that her high society status somehow exempted her from the brutal realities of the American penal system. The marshals dragged her aggressively toward the heavy wooden side doors. Right before she crossed the threshold into the holding area, Heather twisted her neck to look at me one final time. Her face was a mask of sheer, unadulterated disbelief. The terrifying realization had finally penetrated her arrogant skull that her life of luxury designer clothing and stolen wealth was permanently over. She was trading her sprawling suburban mansion for a sterile concrete cage, and she would spend the next decade of her life wearing an institutional jumpsuit. Devin stood up silently, offering absolutely no resistance, as a separate federal marshal secured his wrists tightly behind his back. He looked completely hollowed out, accepting his grim fate with the pathetic resignation of a fundamentally broken man. The heavy metal doors slammed shut, swallowing them both into the dark, unforgiving machinery of the federal justice system. I slowly buttoned my tailored suit jacket, stood up from the wooden gallery bench, and walked out of the heavy double doors of the courtroom. Bradley and Detective Miller flanked my sides as we navigated the crowded, marble-lined corridors of the federal building. As we pushed through the main exit and stepped out onto the wide concrete steps, a blinding flurry of camera flashes erupted from the street level. A massive crowd of local reporters and aggressive news crews had gathered outside the courthouse, eager to secure a sensational soundbite regarding the highly publicized downfall of the young suburban socialite. Several journalists shoved digital recorders and microphones in my direction, shouting rapid-fire questions about my son's prison sentence and the intricate mechanics of my financial retaliation. They wanted a dramatic quote from the vindicated patriarch to boost their evening television ratings and fuel the neighborhood gossip columns. I did not break my stride or offer them a single syllable of satisfaction. I raised my hand in a firm, dismissive gesture, signaling my absolute refusal to participate in their pathetic media circus. I possessed absolutely no desire for fleeting television fame or public validation from strangers who knew nothing about my 40 years of silent, grueling sacrifice. My arduous business was officially concluded. I thanked Bradley and Detective Miller for their relentless professional execution, shook their hands firmly on the bustling sidewalk, and climbed into the back seat of a waiting black town car to leave the chaotic spectacle far behind me. The black town car pulled into my familiar concrete driveway just as the afternoon sun began to set over the quiet Atlanta suburbs. I unlocked my solid oak front door and stepped inside the grand foyer. The house was entirely empty, devoid of the toxic parasitic noise that had plagued my existence for months. I walked straight down the hallway and entered my private study. I approached the heavy mahogany desk and unlocked the top drawer. I pulled out the original, certified physical deed to my property. I ran my thumb over the embossed federal seal, feeling the heavy weight of the thick paper. The fraudulent equity lines, the municipal bribery, and the violent criminal threats were completely eradicated from my life. The fortress Diana and I had built was finally secure, leaving me standing alone in the absolute unbreakable peace of my restored kingdom. 6 months later, I stood on the newly poured concrete sidewalk in the heart of the downtown warehouse district, watching the morning sun reflect off the pristine glass doors of a completely revitalized building. The massive brick structure that was originally supposed to house Heather's fraudulent luxury wellness spa had been entirely renovated and structurally secured from the ground up. I utilized a carefully measured portion of my offshore funds to completely transform the gutted commercial space into a state-of-the-art, vocational training center specifically designed for the underprivileged youth of the city. The giant vinyl banner that once arrogantly announced a vanity project had been permanently replaced by a solid steel sign displaying the name of the new community initiative. The grand opening was scheduled for the following week, but but the massive interior bays were already buzzing with vibrant, productive energy, where massage tables and expensive imported marble tiles were supposed to sit heavy wooden workbenches, and advanced diagnostic machinery now occupied the expansive floors. The corrupt plumbing system that Devon had desperately tried to conceal with illegal municipal bribes was completely ripped out and replaced by licensed unionized professionals who took genuine pride in their meticulous craftsmanship. The air no longer smelled of stagnant deceit and impending financial ruin. It smelled of freshly cut lumber, soldering iron smoke, and the tangible promise of legitimate opportunity. I stood in the doorway, silently observing the undeniable physical manifestation of absolute justice and reclaimed generational wealth standing before me. I stepped further into the main instructional bay and watched dozens of young men and women actively learning essential skills in carpentry, advanced plumbing, and electrical engineering. Observing their intense, dedicated focus brought a profound, deeply comforting memory of Diana flooding back to me. During the hardest years of our marriage, when we were actively fighting against institutional redlining to secure our first mortgage, my beautiful wife always maintained an unshakable belief in the power of community uplift. She frequently told me that true generational wealth was completely meaningless if it was simply hoarded inside a dark steel safe or wasted on shallow suburban vanity. Diana firmly believed that financial resources only gained real value when they were deployed to forge new paths for those trapped in cycles of systemic poverty. I felt an overwhelming sense of alignment with her enduring spirit as I watched the sparks fly from a welding station. The massive capital I had so fiercely protected from my greedy daughter-in-law was finally serving a purpose far greater than luxury vehicles or elite country club memberships. My financial legacy was successfully building strong futures instead of funding destructive family entitlement in the great city today. I left the vibrant industrial warehouse district and drove my vehicle back to the pristine tranquility of my suburban neighborhood. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the neatly manicured lawn. As I pulled into my concrete driveway, I parked the car inside the restored garage, walked up the front steps, and retrieved the daily mail from the heavy brass mailbox mounted next to my solid oak door. I shuffled through the mundane assortment of utility bills and glossy grocery store circulars until my hands stopped completely on a single piece of correspondence. It was a standard coarse paper envelope bearing the official, unmistakable ink stamp of the federal penitentiary system, located 3 hours south of Atlanta. The handwritten return address clearly displayed my son's full legal name, alongside his newly assigned 8-digit federal inmate identification number. I carried the stark white envelope inside the quiet house, walked directly into my private study, and sat down at my heavy mahogany desk. I used a brass letter opener to slice through the top fold and carefully pulled out 2 sheets of lined yellow legal pad paper covered in Devon's frantic handwriting. The letter began with a long, rambling paragraph filled with sweeping apologies and theatrical declarations of immense personal regret. He wrote extensively about how deeply he missed his childhood home and how he suffered every single night within the bleak, terrifying walls of his concrete cell. He swore upon his own life that the harsh realities of the federal justice system had completely rehabilitated his character and firmly cured him of his arrogant entitlement. However, the true motivation behind his desperate communication became blatantly obvious halfway down the second page. After exhausting his supply of hollow apologies, Devon shamelessly pivoted to his current financial distress. He begged me to deposit $500 directly into his institutional commissary account by the end of the week. He claimed he desperately needed the cash to purchase basic hygiene supplies and edible food to survive the brutal prison environment, attempting to manipulate my paternal instincts one final time from behind heavy iron bars. I sat in the absolute stillness of my study and read the desperate letter completely through a second time, analyzing every single word with a cold, detached scrutiny. Beneath the flowery language and the dramatic declarations of newfound morality, I easily recognized the exact same toxic manipulation that had defined his entire adult life. Devon was not genuinely apologizing for actively trying to destroy my generational legacy or attempting to have me permanently locked inside a psychiatric ward just 6 months prior. He was simply apologizing because his fraudulent actions had finally caught up to him, resulting in severe personal discomfort and a total loss of his high society luxury. He still firmly believed that his biological connection automatically entitled him to my financial resources whenever he found himself trapped in a corner. I realized with absolute clarity that responding to his pathetic plea or depositing a single dollar into his institutional account would merely validate his deeply flawed worldview and instantly restart the cycle of endless exploitation. I took a very long, steady breath, feeling the final, lingering remnants of paternal obligation completely evaporate from my soul. I slowly stood up from my heavy mahogany desk, walked directly over to the heavy industrial paper shredder, sitting silently in the corner of my office, and methodically fed the 2 yellow pages into the grinding metal blades. I watched the frantic manipulative handwriting dissolve instantly into thousands of meaningless tiny white strips, without ever shedding a single tear. I owed the cowardly man sitting in that federal prison absolutely nothing anymore. I turned away from the mechanical hum of the shredder and walked slowly out the back door onto my wide concrete patio. The cool evening breeze gently rustled the green leaves of the towering oak trees standing proudly along the perimeter of my highly secure property. I looked quietly at the exact open space where the fateful family reunion took place just 6 short months ago. The incredibly toxic, parasitic elements that once threatened to completely destroy my beautiful home and erase my personal legacy had been permanently and ruthlessly excised from my daily life. I walked over to the outdoor refrigerator and retrieved the exact bottle of vintage champagne Heather had arrogantly opened on that devastating evening. I poured myself a single generous glass of the sparkling wine. I stood tall, raised the flawless crystal glass high toward the vibrant colors of the setting sun, and completely enjoyed the absolute unbreakable peace of my brilliantly restored personal order today. The most profound lesson extracted from this harrowing ordeal completely transcends the mere mechanical execution of financial retaliation or the cold pursuit of legal justice against treacherous family members. It fundamentally redefines the modern concept of generational wealth and exposes the incredibly toxic, pervasive illusion of unearned entitlement. For decades, society has actively perpetuated a deeply flawed narrative regarding the transfer of familial assets. We are conditioned to inherently believe that bloodlines automatically guarantee a secure, prosperous future, and that the exhausting labor of the older generation must unconditionally serve as a permanent, unbreakable safety net for the reckless ambitions of the youth. Devin and Heather operated entirely upon this parasitic philosophy, deeply convinced that my grueling 40 years of manual labor were solely designed to fund their shallow high society vanity projects. They fatally misunderstood that true generational wealth is not simply a towering pile of untraceable cash or a sprawling suburban mansion waiting to be carelessly looted. Genuine wealth is built upon a rigid, unbreakable foundation of immense personal sacrifice, unwavering discipline, and profound communal responsibility. When Diana and I scrubbed black grease from our exhausted hands and fought viciously against systemic redlining to secure our historic property, we were not merely collecting physical assets. We were actively forging a resilient moral character. We intended to pass down that exact same resilience, teaching our son how to stand firmly on his own 2 feet in a world that would inevitably attempt to break him. However, when parents provide an abundance of financial comfort without simultaneously enforcing the strict boundaries of personal accountability, they inadvertently breed a terrifying, insatiable monster of entitlement. Devin did not look at my home and see the decades of quiet suffering that paid for every single brick. He merely saw a convenient, liquid asset ready to be liquidated for a fraudulent commercial wellness spa. He believed that his biological connections somehow exempted him from the universal laws of consequence, effort, and basic human decency. This devastating narrative serves as a brutal but necessary reminder that unconditional love must never be foolishly equated with unconditional financial submission. As parents, guardians, and architects of family legacies, we often blur the critical line between protecting our descendants and actively enabling their most destructive parasitic behaviors. We mistakenly assume that offering continuous financial salvation is the ultimate expression of parental devotion. In absolute reality, continuously shielding an arrogant, greedy individual from the harsh natural consequences of their own malicious actions is a profound disservice. It strips them of their required independence and cultivates a cowardly mindset that easily resorts to manipulation, bribery, and even elder abuse when the money eventually stops flowing. My ultimate triumph was not merely stripping my treacherous daughter-in-law of her luxury vehicles or watching my cowardly son face a lengthy federal prison sentence. My ultimate victory was reclaiming my absolute sovereignty and refusing to let my life's work fuel their corruption. True legacy requires an intense, uncompromising protection of your own personal dignity. You must be entirely willing to look the people you love the most directly in the eye and say no, even if it permanently fractures the comfortable illusion of a happy, unified family. You must recognize that the resources you generated through decades of your own sweat and tears belong entirely to you. You maintain the absolute, unquestionable right to dictate how, when, and where your wealth is deployed. If your flesh and blood choose to view you as a disposable obstacle standing between them and their unearned inheritance, you must possess the iron fortitude to completely sever those toxic ties without shedding a single tear of regret. You must redirect your valuable energy and hard-earned resources toward avenues that genuinely uplift your community and honor your original struggles, just as I did by transforming their fraudulent, corrupt commercial property into a legitimate vocational training center for the youth of our city. Never allow the crippling fear of isolation or the heavy burden of societal expectations to force you into a quiet, miserable submission. Your life, your property, and your profound wisdom are not mere commodities to be impatiently traded by those who refuse to build their own empires. Stand tall within the fortress you built, guard your borders with absolute vigilance, and never apologize for fiercely protecting the peace you have rightfully earned. If this story resonates with the silent battles you are currently fighting behind closed doors, it is time to finally reclaim your unyielding power. Evaluate your financial boundaries today. Secure your essential legal documents immediately and aggressively cut off any parasitic attachments draining your spirit. Leave a comment below sharing your own personal triumphs over toxic entitlement, and fiercely subscribe